The cold hit like a fist. Eleanor stepped off that train into a world that seemed determined to freeze her solid before she'd taken 10 steps. The wind came howling down from the mountains, carrying ice and the smell of wood smoke and something else, something sharp and unfamiliar, that she'd later learn was just the scent of a place that didn't give a damn whether you lived or died. She pulled her coat tighter, but it didn't help. The coat had been made for Boston winters, not this, not Montana, not the kind of cold that found every gap in the fabric and exploited it with ruthless efficiency. The platform was nearly deserted, a few men loading cargo onto freight cars. A woman with 2 small children hurrying toward the station house. And standing near the ticket window, looking like he wanted to be literally anywhere else, was Thomas Pritchard, her intended husband. Eleanor had studied his photographs so many times she'd memorized every detail. The neat mustache, the serious eyes, the respectable collar and tie. In his letters, he described himself as a practical man of business, someone who valued intelligence and capability over frivolous sentimentality. He owned a dry goods store. He attended church. He was looking for a partner in life, not a decoration. A partner. That word had done so much heavy lifting in her decision to come here. Partnership implied equality, mutual respect, a shared endeavor. But the man walking toward her now didn't look like he wanted a partner. He looked like he'd just discovered a serious miscalculation. "Miss Vance?" His voice was thin, reedy, nothing like the confidence his letters had suggested. "Mr. Pritchard," Eleanor extended her hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." He stared at her hand like it was a foreign object. His eyes traveled up and up and up until he was looking at her face. She was used to that look, the shock, the quick reassessment, the moment when people realized that the tall woman they'd heard about was actually tall, not just tall for a woman, not just notably above average, but genuinely, uncomfortably impossible to ignore tall. 6 feet exactly. Taller in the boots she was wearing now. Taller than Thomas Pritchard by a solid 3 inches. He didn't shake her hand. He cleared his throat. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." The platform suddenly felt very small. Eleanor became aware of other eyes on them. The cargo loaders had stopped working. The woman with the children had paused near the station house door. "A misunderstanding," Eleanor repeated carefully. "You didn't mention—" He gestured vaguely at her, at all of her. "In your letters, you never said you were tall?" The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "I mentioned it twice, Mr. Pritchard, once in my 3rd letter and again in my 5th. I was quite specific about it, actually. I wrote that I was 6 feet in height and understood this might be unusual, but hoped it wouldn't present a problem for a man who valued capability over convention." "Yes, but I didn't think—" He was sweating now, despite the cold. "I thought perhaps you were exaggerating, or that you meant 5'6" and had made a writing error. I didn't think you meant 6 feet. Actual 6 feet." Eleanor set down her suitcase. Her hands were shaking, but she didn't think it was from the cold anymore. "I see. It's not that there's anything wrong with you," he said quickly. "I'm sure you're a perfectly fine woman, but people would talk. My customers would talk. The whole town would talk. A man can't have a wife who towers over him. It's not natural. It's not right." "Not right," she echoed. "You understand, don't you?" He actually looked hopeful, like she might agree with him, like she might nod and apologize for being too tall and promise to shrink. "It's not personal. It's just, the situation is impossible." Something was building in Eleanor's chest, something hot and awful and familiar. It was the same feeling she'd had sitting in her father's study 3 months ago while he explained, in his patient, reasonable voice, why he couldn't continue supporting an unmarried daughter who was 28 years old and showed no prospects of changing that status. The same feeling she'd had in Mrs. Peterson's parlor when she'd overheard 2 women discussing how tragic it was that poor Eleanor Vance was so unnaturally tall that no respectable man would ever want her. The same feeling that had chased her through every social gathering, every church service, every family dinner where some well-meaning aunt asked if she'd considered stooping just a little, just to make herself less imposing. "So what happens now?" Her voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. Thomas Pritchard looked relieved that she was being reasonable about this. "Well, I can give you money for a return ticket, of course. I'll cover the cost of your journey back to Boston. It's only fair." And if I don't want to go back to Boston? That seemed to genuinely confuse him. Where else would you go? Good question. Eleanor looked past him at the town stretching out beyond the station. It wasn't much. One main street lined with wooden buildings that looked like they'd been thrown together in a hurry and hadn't been maintained since. A church with a leaning steeple. A saloon already doing brisk business, even though it couldn't be past 10 in the morning. Mountains rising in the distance, snow-covered and impossibly vast. There was nothing here for her. But there was nothing back in Boston either. I'll need to think about it, she said. Thomas Pritchard's relief evaporated. Think about what? Miss Vance, you can't stay here. You have no connections, no family, no means of support. I have $17 and some cents, Eleanor said. That's more than some people start with. You're being unreasonable. I'm being realistic. If I go back to Boston, I'll be right where I was 3 months ago. At least here, I'm somewhere different. You'll be destitute here? I might be, but I'll be destitute somewhere I haven't already failed. She picked up her suitcase before he could argue further. It was heavier than it had been that morning. Funny how hope could weigh nothing at all, and its absence could make everything heavier. Miss Vance, Eleanor, please be reasonable about this. She turned back to look at him. This man who'd written such thoughtful letters about building a life together, who'd described his business and his modest home and his dreams of expansion, who'd said he wanted a woman of substance, not some giggling girl who couldn't balance a ledger. He'd wanted all of that, just not at 6 feet tall. I am being reasonable, Eleanor said. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Pritchard. I appreciate you showing me exactly who you are before I made an even bigger mistake. She walked away before he could respond. Her boots struck the wooden platform with decisive thuds that echoed in the cold air. She didn't look back. The station house was warmer, but not by much. A pot-bellied stove radiated heat that seemed to dissipate about 3 feet from its source. A clerk sat behind a wire cage, reading a newspaper and looking profoundly bored. Eleanor approached the window. Excuse me. I'm looking for information about boarding houses. The clerk glanced up, did the usual double-take at her height, then consulted a ledger with exaggerated slowness. Mrs. Donnelly runs a respectable place on 4th Street. $2 a week, meals included. She's particular about her guests, though. No drinking, no men after 8 o'clock, church attendance expected on Sundays. That sounds acceptable. Of course, she might be full up. A lot of people coming through lately with the railroad work. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Are there other options? There's the Frontier Hotel, but that's $4 a week, and the rooms aren't much better than Mrs. Donnelly's. Then there's Mrs. Chen's place over on 6th, but he trailed off meaningfully. But what? Well, it's a Chinese establishment, isn't it? Respectable women don't generally... Where is it exactly? He told her, disapproval radiating from every syllable. Eleanor thanked him and left. 4th Street turned out to be a rutted dirt road lined with houses that ranged from barely standing to actively collapsing. Mrs. Donnelly's boarding house was one of the better examples. A 2-story structure with peeling paint and a porch that sagged in the middle but otherwise looked reasonably solid. Eleanor knocked. The woman who answered was short, round, and possessed the kind of face that suggested she'd seen every variety of human foolishness and wasn't impressed by any of it. Yes? Good morning. I was told you might have a room available. Mrs. Donnelly looked Eleanor up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who'd learned to judge character quickly and trust her instincts. You got references? I have a letter from my previous employer in Boston. I worked as a bookkeeper for a law firm. What brings you to Cutter's Pass? Eleanor hesitated. The truth seemed pathetic. A lie seemed worse. I came here to marry a man who changed his mind when he saw me. Something shifted in Mrs. Donnelly's expression. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. Like she'd heard that story before, maybe lived some version of it herself. Because of your height. Yes. Men are idiots, Mrs. Donnelly said flatly. Present company's ex-husband included. Come in before you freeze to death. The interior of the boarding house was clean but threadbare, furniture that had seen better days. Wallpaper faded to the point where its original pattern was anyone's guess. But it was warm, and it smelled like bread baking, and that was enough to make Eleanor's throat tighten with something that might have been gratitude or might have been the beginning of tears. I've got one room left, Mrs. Donnelly said, leading her up a narrow staircase. Previous tenant left sudden-like to get married. It's small, but the roof doesn't leak and the window latches properly. $2 a week includes breakfast and supper. You're responsible for your own washing, and I don't tolerate any nonsense. No drinking, no smoking, no entertaining men in your room. That all sounds perfectly acceptable. The room was indeed small. A narrow bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a single chair. But the quilt on the bed looked warm, and the window had actual curtains, and Eleanor had lived in worse places. I can pay for 2 weeks in advance, Eleanor said. Mrs. Donnelly's eyebrows rose. You planning to stay that long? I'm planning to try. Doing what? There aren't many jobs for women in this town, and the ones that exist aren't… She paused delicately. They aren't respectable. I'm a trained bookkeeper. I can do accounts, manage inventory, handle correspondence. Surely there's a business in town that needs help with their books. Mrs. Donnelly's expression suggested she thought Eleanor was being optimistic to the point of delusion, but she accepted the $4 without further comment. Supper's at 6. Don't be late or you'll miss it. The other boarders are 2 school teachers and a widow who works at the dry goods store. They're decent women. They'll help you find your feet if you let them. After she left, Eleanor sat on the bed and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to feel the full weight of her situation. She was alone in a town where she knew no one. She had $13 left. She had no job and no prospects. The man who'd promised her a future had rejected her based on nothing more than her appearance. Everything she'd gambled on coming here had turned to ash in the space of one conversation. 3 minutes. Then she stood up, unpacked her suitcase, and started planning. The next morning, Eleanor put on her best dress, a dark blue wool that had been carefully maintained but couldn't quite hide its age, and set out to find employment. The dry goods store was her first stop. It seemed logical. Thomas Pritchard had mentioned he needed someone to help with inventory. Perhaps whoever had taken over those duties after she'd failed to arrive might want to be relieved of them. The store was exactly what she'd expected. Neat shelves stocked with practical necessities, a counter polished to a shine, everything organized with a precision that suggested someone cared about order. Thomas Pritchard stood behind that counter, and his face went white when he saw her. Miss Vance? Mr. Pritchard. I was wondering if you might need help with your bookkeeping. The silence stretched out like taffy. I'm afraid I don't, he said finally. I see. Do you know of anyone else in town who might? No. I can't think of anyone. He was lying. Eleanor could see it in the way he wouldn't meet her eyes, but she couldn't exactly call him a liar in his own store. Thank you for your time. She tried the general store next, then the feed and grain, then the restaurant on Main Street that advertised home-cooked meals. Each time the answer was the same. No, they didn't need help. No, they didn't know anyone who did. No, there wasn't anything available. By noon, Eleanor had been rejected by every business on Main Street. Some people were polite about it, others weren't. But the result was always the same. She was too tall, too strange, too much. The schoolhouse was her last hope. Surely education was supposed to be progressive, enlightened. Surely people who taught children wouldn't judge her based on something as arbitrary as height. The headmaster was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the permanent expression of someone smelling something unpleasant. We don't have any teaching positions available, he said before she'd even finished introducing herself. I wasn't necessarily hoping to teach. I thought perhaps you might need help with administration, record keeping, correspondence with the Territorial Education Board. We manage just fine with our current arrangements. I see. Might I leave my credentials with you in case something becomes available? He glanced at the letter from her previous employer with obvious disinterest. You can leave it, but I wouldn't expect anything to come of it. We prefer to hire locally when possible. Eleanor walked back to the boarding house through streets that felt actively hostile. The wind had picked up, driving ice crystals into her face like tiny needles. Her boots were letting in water. Her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves. But it was the looks that bothered her most. People stared. Of course they stared. She'd been dealing with that her entire life. But here, the stares felt different. In Boston, people had at least tried to be subtle about it. Here, they just openly gawked. A woman coming out of the general store actually stopped walking to stare at her. 2 men outside the saloon nudged each other and laughed. She was a spectacle, an oddity. entertainment for people with nothing better to do. By the time Eleanor reached Mrs. Donnelly's boarding house, her carefully maintained composure was cracking. She made it to her room before the tears came, which was something. Small victories. She cried for exactly 10 minutes. Then she washed her face, fixed her hair, and went down to supper. The other boarders were indeed decent women. Miss Sarah Collins and Miss Margaret Porter, both school teachers in their 30s, had the kind of practical intelligence that came from managing rooms full of children every day. Mrs. Helen Nash, the widow who worked at the dry goods store, which meant she worked for Thomas Pritchard, which explained the pitying look she kept sending Eleanor's way, was quieter but kind. "Any luck today?" Mrs. Donnelly asked, as she served stew that was mostly potatoes with occasional sightings of actual meat. "Not yet," Eleanor said. "You tried Calloway's office." "The lawyer? No. Might be worth a shot. He's always buried in paperwork. Could probably use someone who knows her way around a ledger." Eleanor added it to her mental list. The conversation moved on to other topics. Local gossip, mostly. Who was courting whom? Which business was doing well? The railroad's latest delays. Eleanor let it wash over her, contributing when expected, but mostly just absorbing information. These women knew this town in a way she never would. They knew its rhythms, its hierarchies, its unspoken rules. They knew which people to trust and which to avoid. They knew how to navigate a world that was often hostile to women trying to make their own way. Eleanor needed to learn what they knew. After supper, Miss Collins cornered her in the hallway. "I heard what happened with Thomas Pritchard," she said quietly. "The whole town's heard by now. I'm sorry." "Thank you. For what it's worth, you're better off without him. He's a small man in every sense of the word." "That seems to be the prevailing opinion in this house." Miss Collins smiled. It transformed her rather plain face into something almost beautiful. "We women have to stick together, especially in a place like this. If you need anything, advice, connections, just someone to talk to, don't hesitate to ask. I appreciate that more than you know." "Good. Now get some rest. Tomorrow's a new day, and you look exhausted." Eleanor climbed the stairs to her small room and tried to feel hopeful about tomorrow. She failed. The next week followed the same pattern. Wake up, put on the dress that was starting to look worn from constant wearing, walk the streets looking for work, get rejected, return to the boarding house, pretend everything was fine during supper, retreat to her room, counter dwindling money, try not to panic. She was down to $8. Mr. Calloway, the lawyer, had been polite but firm. He did his own books and preferred to keep it that way. The newspaper editor didn't need help. The hotel owner laughed in her face. Even the Chinese laundry, which Eleanor tried despite the clerk's disapproval, had no work for her. On the 8th day, Eleanor stood in her room and faced the mathematics of her situation. $8. Maybe $9 if she was careful about meals. 2 weeks of lodging at most. Then what? She could write to her father, beg him to send money for a return ticket. The thought made her physically ill. She could already hear his voice. "I told you this would end badly, Eleanor. Your pride has always been your downfall." He'd pay for the ticket, but the cost would be her dignity and any remaining shred of independence. Or she could stay here and starve. Some choice. Eleanor was contemplating these options when she heard shouting from downstairs. Raised voices. Mrs. Donnelly's sharp tone cutting through someone's protests. Curious despite herself, Eleanor opened her door. "Don't care what he wants. You can't just barge into my house." "The boss sent me with a message for the tall woman. I'm delivering it." "Then deliver it like a civilized person instead of tracking mud through my front hall." Eleanor descended the stairs to find Mrs. Donnelly facing off against a man who looked like he'd been carved from a mountainside and then weathered for a few decades. Huge, grizzled, wearing furs that made him look even larger and a hat that shadowed his face. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and Eleanor got her first good look at him. Hard eyes. A scar cutting through one eyebrow. A beard that probably had things living in it. He studied her with the same assessing gaze she'd been subjected to countless times, but there was something different about it. He wasn't judging her appearance. He was measuring her. "You're Eleanor Vance," he said. Not a question. "I am. I got a message from Mr. Rook. He wants to talk to you about a job." Eleanor's heart did something complicated. Hope and suspicion tangled together. "What kind of job?" The kind that pays. If you're interested, I'll take you to him. Now? Now. Mrs. Donnelly made a noise of protest. She's not going anywhere with you, Silas Murphy. I don't care who sent you. She can make her own choices, Silas said mildly. He was right about that. Eleanor looked at this man, this stranger sent by someone she'd never met, and did the math again. $8, 2 weeks, then nothing. What did she have to lose? I'll get my coat, she said. Mrs. Donnelly followed her upstairs, hissing objections. You don't know anything about this Rook person. He lives up in the mountains like some kind of hermit. People say he's strange, maybe dangerous. People say a lot of things, Eleanor said, pulling on her coat. Most of it nonsense. This is reckless. This is survival. Eleanor came back downstairs. Silas nodded approval and headed for the door. Eleanor followed, very aware of Mrs. Donnelly and the other boarders watching her go with expressions ranging from concern to outright alarm. The cold hit her like a wall. Silas had a wagon waiting, pulled by 2 enormous horses that looked like they could pull a house if necessary. He helped her up onto the seat with surprising courtesy, then climbed up himself. How far? Eleanor asked. 6 miles, straight up. The wagon lurched into motion. They left the town behind, following a road that quickly became more suggestion than actual path. The mountains rose around them, vast and indifferent. Snow clung to everything. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the horses breathing, and the wind moving through the trees. Silas didn't speak. Eleanor didn't either. She was too busy wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, or possibly the best decision. The difference between the two was sometimes hard to spot until it was too late. The road climbed and climbed. Eleanor gripped the edge of the wagon seat as the wheels found ruts she couldn't see in the fading light. The horses didn't seem bothered. They pulled steadily upward, their breath coming out in great clouds of steam. Silas held the reins with the casual confidence of someone who'd made this trip 1,000 times, probably in worse conditions. The town disappeared behind them. Then the trees closed in, and there was nothing but forest and mountains and the growing certainty that Eleanor had made a catastrophic error in judgment. This Mr. Rook, she said, breaking the silence because it was starting to feel oppressive. What does he do exactly? Trades. Eleanor waited for more. None came. Trades what? Furs mostly, some timber, whatever the mountains give up that people down below want to buy. And he needs help with that? Silas cut her a sideways look. He needs help with the parts that involve talking to people and writing things down. The boss isn't much for either. Is he... Eleanor chose her words carefully. Is he difficult to work with? Depends on what you mean by difficult. He won't make small talk, won't smile at your jokes, won't pretend to care about things he doesn't care about. Some people find that difficult. I find it refreshing. How long have you worked for him? Going on 12 years. That's a long time. It is. So he must be a fair employer. Silas actually smiled at that, though it wasn't particularly comforting. Fair's one word for it. The boss doesn't lie, doesn't cheat, doesn't ask for anything he wouldn't do himself. Pays on time, every time. Doesn't care where you came from or what you look like or whether you fit anyone's idea of normal. He paused. Of course, he also doesn't care if you're comfortable or happy or having a good time. You do the work or you don't. Simple as that. Eleanor absorbed this information. It wasn't encouraging exactly, but it wasn't discouraging either. After a week of being judged for nothing but her height, the idea of working for someone who didn't care about appearances had a certain appeal. Why me? She asked. How does he even know I exist? The boss hears things, and he needed someone who could handle books and correspondence. Someone who wouldn't fall apart at the first sign of hard work. Silas shrugged. Heard you'd been looking for work. Heard no one would hire you because you're tall. Figured maybe you'd be desperate enough to take a job nobody else wants. That's honest. Like I said, the boss doesn't lie. The wagon crested a ridge, and Eleanor caught her first glimpse of what lay ahead. A valley carved between 2 mountains, filled with trees that looked black in the failing light. A thin column of smoke rising from somewhere in the middle of all that darkness. That's where we're going? That's home. The road, if it could even be called that, descended into the valley. The temperature dropped as they lost the sun completely. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter, but it was useless. The cold here was different from the cold in town. It had weight, substance. It pressed against her like something alive. By the time they reached the bottom of the valley, full dark had fallen. Silas lit a lantern hanging from the front of the wagon, casting a weak circle of light that did more to emphasize the surrounding darkness than illuminate anything useful. Then buildings emerged from the gloom. Not a house. Houses. Plural. A main structure built from logs that looked like they'd been standing since before Eleanor was born. A barn that could have housed a dozen horses. Several smaller outbuildings whose purposes Eleanor couldn't guess. Everything solid, functional, built to last. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop near the main building. "Wait here," he said, climbing down. Eleanor waited. The door to the main building opened, spilling warm light across the snow. Silas went inside. Voices drifted out, too low for Eleanor to make out words. Then Silas reappeared and jerked his head in a clear gesture. "Come on." Eleanor climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the cold and the long ride. She followed Silas through the door into a room that was shockingly warm after the frigid journey. It was a workspace. That was Eleanor's first impression. A large table dominated the center, covered with papers, ledgers, receipts, correspondence, all of it in various states of organization. Or more accurately, complete disorganization. Maps hung on the walls alongside what looked like inventory lists. A fire burned in a massive stone fireplace, and standing near that fire, studying her with an intensity that made her want to step backward, was the largest man Eleanor had ever seen. Not fat, not even bulky in the way Silas was bulky, just big, tall, easily 6.5 feet, maybe more, broad across the shoulders, arms that looked like they could snap a tree in half, a face that might have been handsome if it hadn't been so severe, dark hair pulled back, a beard that was at least better maintained than Silas's, and eyes that seemed to take in everything about her in one sweeping assessment. He didn't speak. Eleanor found herself doing what she always did in uncomfortable situations. She filled the silence. "Mr. Rook? I'm Eleanor Vance. Silas said you wanted to speak with me about a position." "I know who you are." His voice matched the rest of him, deep, rough, the kind of voice that didn't get used much for conversation. "Then you have me at a disadvantage." He didn't respond to that, just kept looking at her with those unsettling eyes. Eleanor decided to try a different approach. "I understand you need help with correspondence and bookkeeping. Can you do it?" "Yes." "How do I know that?" Eleanor bristled. After a week of rejection, her patience for being questioned was running thin. "I have a letter of reference from my previous employer. I worked for Hartwell and Sons in Boston for 6 years managing their accounts. I can provide examples of my work if you'd like." "Don't care about letters. Can you do the job?" "I just said I could." "Then prove it." He gestured at the table with its mountain of paperwork. Eleanor approached cautiously. Up close, the chaos was even worse than she'd thought. Bills of sale mixed with receipts. Correspondence dated from 6 months ago piled on top of invoices from last week. A ledger that appeared to have entries made in 3 different handwriting styles, none of them particularly legible. "This is..." She stopped herself before saying disaster. "This requires organization." "That's why you're here." Eleanor picked up the ledger, flipped through pages of increasingly incomprehensible entries. "Who's been keeping these books?" "Me. Silas when I'm not here. Sometimes Martin when neither of us can do it." "And Martin is?" "Works the trap lines in winter. Good with animals. Can't write worth a damn." Eleanor set down the ledger and surveyed the mess with a growing sense of what might have been excitement if she wasn't so tired and cold. This was fixable. Difficult, time-consuming, but absolutely fixable. And there was something appealing about the challenge of it, a problem with a clear solution. "I can organize this," she said, "but it's going to take time, weeks probably. Everything needs to be sorted, categorized, entered properly. You'll need a better system going forward. So fix it." "What's the pay?" Rook named a figure that made Eleanor's heart jump. It was more than she'd made in Boston, significantly more. "That's monthly?" she asked, certain she'd misheard. "Weekly." Eleanor stared at him. That's excessive for bookkeeping. It's not just bookkeeping. You'll handle all business correspondence, manage inventory, coordinate with suppliers, deal with anyone who comes here wanting to trade. Basically anything that involves talking to people or writing things down. Why so much? Because I'm paying you not to ask questions like that. Fair enough. When would I start? Now. Now. It's nearly 8 o'clock at night. So? Eleanor realized he was serious. She also realized something else. She was still wearing her coat because despite the fire, this room was barely warmer than outside. And she was exhausted from the long ride. And she had no idea how she was supposed to get back to town. Mr. Rook, I appreciate the offer, but I need to return to my lodgings. I can start tomorrow morning if you're staying here. That stopped her cold. Excuse me? 6 miles each way. Every day. In winter. That's not practical. There's a room upstairs. You'll stay there. I haven't agreed to take the position. You will. The certainty in his voice should have been insulting, but it wasn't wrong. Eleanor needed this job, desperately. They both knew it. I'd like to see this room before I make any decisions. Rook nodded to Silas, who led her to a narrow staircase at the back of the room. The second floor was darker, colder. Silas pushed open a door and held up his lantern. The room was small, but not tiny. A bed with what looked like actual mattress and blankets. A dresser, a chair, a window. The walls were bare logs, gaps between them chinked with some kind of plaster. A small stove in the corner, currently unlit. It's not fancy, Silas said, but it's warm once you get the stove going, private. The boss doesn't come up here. Eleanor walked to the window. Couldn't see much in the dark, just her own reflection looking back at her. Pale, exhausted, desperate. What's the arrangement exactly? She asked. Room and board included in the pay? Yeah, meals with everyone else. You're responsible for keeping your own space clean. Boss is particular about that. Everyone else being Ishiyasis, me, the boss, Martin when he's here, a couple of other men who work the timber operations. They've got their own building, though. You won't be bothered. Eleanor turned to look at him. And if I am bothered? Silas's expression went flat. Won't happen. The boss made it real clear. Anyone who disrespects you answers to him. And trust me, nobody wants that. It wasn't exactly reassuring, but it was something. Eleanor went back downstairs. Rook hadn't moved from his position near the fire. He watched her descend with that same intense focus, like he was trying to see through her skin to whatever lay underneath. I'll take the position, Eleanor said. On a trial basis. 2 weeks. If it's not working for either of us, I can leave with no hard feelings. Fine. I'll need to collect my things from town. Silas will take you tomorrow. Tonight you rest. I haven't eaten. Rook looked at Silas, who sighed and headed for what Eleanor assumed was a kitchen. Left alone with her new employer, Eleanor suddenly felt the weight of what she'd just agreed to. Living in the mountains with men she didn't know. Miles from anyone who might help her if things went wrong. Completely dependent on the goodwill of a man who looked like he could break her in half without much effort. You're afraid, Rook said. It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. I'd be stupid not to be. Smart. Scared is smart. He moved away from the fire, and Eleanor forced herself not to step back as he approached. But I'm not going to hurt you. Won't let anyone else hurt you either. You do the work, you'll be treated fair. That's the deal. And if I can't do the work, then you can't. We figure that out when it happens, not before. Silas returned with a plate of food, bread, cheese, some kind of meat that was tougher than shoe leather but warm. Eleanor ate standing up, suddenly ravenous. The men watched her without comment, which she appreciated. The silence felt less oppressive now, almost comfortable. When she finished, Rook gestured to the stairs. Get some sleep. We start at dawn. Eleanor climbed the stairs, found her way to the small room, and managed to get the stove lit after several failed attempts. As warmth slowly filled the space, she sat on the bed and tried to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. This morning she'd been in town, nearly out of money, facing the very real possibility of complete destitution. Tonight she was in the mountains, with a job that paid more than she'd ever earned, and a room that was, if nothing else, private. It was insane. It was reckless. It was possibly the best decision she'd ever made. Or possibly the worst. She'd find out tomorrow. Eleanor slept badly, waking every time the wind rattled the window, or the stove settled, or some night sound from the forest drifted through the walls. By the time gray light started seeping through the gaps in the curtains, she'd given up entirely. She dressed in the same worn blue dress, wished for the 100th time she'd brought more practical clothes, and headed downstairs. The workroom was already occupied. Rook sat at the table, reading what appeared to be a letter, his face set in an expression of deep concentration, or possibly irritation. It was hard to tell. He looked up when she entered. "Coffee's on the stove." Eleanor found the kitchen, a surprisingly well-organized space with a massive iron stove and shelves stocked with basic supplies. The coffee was thick enough to stand a spoon in and tasted like it had been brewing since midnight, but it was hot and strong, and that was enough. She returned to find Rook still reading the same letter, his jaw tight. "Problem?" she asked. "Always." He tossed the letter onto the pile. "Supplier in Denver says they can't fill the order. 3rd time this month. Is there an alternative supplier?" "Not at their prices." Eleanor set down her coffee and picked up the letter. The supplier's refusal was polite but firm. "Too much demand, not enough product. Sorry for the inconvenience." "What are you ordering?" "Steel traps. Good ones. The cheap ones fall apart after one season." Eleanor read the letter again, then started sorting through the pile until she found what she was looking for: previous correspondence with the same supplier. "They filled your orders before, large orders too. What changed?" Rook's expression suggested he didn't like being questioned, but he answered anyway. "New management, new policies. Smaller customers get dropped when they can't keep up with demand. And you're a smaller customer." "Compared to the big outfits, yeah." Eleanor studied the letters, thinking. What if you weren't? What if instead of ordering for yourself, you coordinated orders with other trappers in the region, pooled the demand? Suddenly you're not a small customer anymore. Rook stared at her like she'd started speaking a foreign language. "Other trappers don't want to coordinate with me." "Why not?" "Because I'm..." He gestured vaguely at himself, at the mountains, at everything. This. Eleanor didn't know what this meant exactly, but she could guess. The isolation, the reputation, whatever it was that made people in town talk about him like he was something other than human. "Do they respect your work?" "I guess." "Do they trust you to deliver quality?" "Yeah." "Then they'll coordinate if there's profit in it. People will tolerate a lot for the right price." Rook sat back in his chair, which creaked alarmingly under his weight. "You've been here less than 12 hours, and you're already reorganizing my business relationships. You hired me to handle business matters. This is a business matter." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "Write the letter." "To whom?" "The supplier. Tell them we're putting together a coordinated order. See if that changes their tune." Eleanor found paper and pen, both in surprisingly good condition, and drafted a letter while Rook watched. She kept it brief and professional, emphasizing the potential volume and the reliability of coordinated delivery schedules. When she finished, she handed it to Rook. He read it slowly, lips moving slightly as he worked through the words. Eleanor realized with a start that reading wasn't easy for him. Not illiterate, but not comfortable either. "This is good," he said finally. "Send it." The morning progressed in a similar pattern. Rook would present a problem: delayed shipment, disputed invoice, request for information, and Eleanor would either solve it immediately or add it to a growing list of things requiring more time and attention. By noon, she'd sorted the correspondence into categories: urgent, important, routine, and what the hell is this even about? The last pile was distressingly large. Silas appeared around 1 o'clock with food: more bread, some kind of stew that was actually good, and apples that were slightly wrinkled but edible. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, setting everything on the one clear corner of the table. "Thank you." Eleanor realized she was starving. Again, apparently, mountain air did that. "Boss is in the barn if you need him." "What's he doing?" "Fixing a harness, or possibly making a new one. Hard to tell with him." After Silas left, Eleanor ate quickly and returned to the paperwork. There was something deeply satisfying about bringing order to chaos. Each sorted pile, each categorized document, each entry made in the ledger felt like a small victory. She was 3 hours into creating a proper filing system when Rook returned, bringing with him the smell of leather and wood smoke. "Progress?" he asked. "Some. I've organized the correspondence and started entering the backlog into the ledger. But there are gaps. Transactions that don't have supporting documentation, dates that don't match up, entries that make no sense." "Like what?" Eleanor pointed to a particularly baffling entry. "This says you sold 15 beaver pelts for $3. That's absurdly low. Either the quantity is wrong, the price is wrong, or something else is happening that isn't reflected in the books." Rook leaned over to look, and Eleanor became acutely aware of how large he was, how much space he took up, how the temperature seemed to rise slightly when he was close. "Oh, that was a charity thing." "A charity thing?" "Widow Johnson. Her husband died in a logging accident last year. She's got 4 kids and no income. Bought the pelts at cost so she could resell them in town for actual money." Eleanor looked at him. "That's not reflected anywhere in your books." "Should it be?" "Yes. If you're going to do charitable transactions, they need to be documented separately, or your books will never balance properly." "Fine. Document it." Eleanor added it to her list of things to fix. The list was getting long. They worked in silence for a while, Rook handling some kind of repair work on equipment Eleanor couldn't identify while she wrestled with the accounting disaster he'd created. "Question," she said eventually. "Yeah? Why do you live up here? It's beautiful, but it's also incredibly isolated. You could run this operation from town." Rook didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was careful, measured. "Town's loud. Too many people. Too many expectations about how you're supposed to act, what you're supposed to say. Up here, I don't have to pretend to be something I'm not." "What are you?" He looked at her then, really looked at her. "Someone who doesn't fit. Same as you." The observation stung because it was accurate. Eleanor had spent her entire life being told she didn't fit. Didn't fit into dresses designed for shorter women, didn't fit into social situations where height was supposed to be a masculine trait, didn't fit into anyone's vision of what a woman should be. "I suppose that's true," she said quietly. "Difference is, I stopped trying to fit, came up here, built something that works for me. People think I'm strange, fine, let them think it. Doesn't change anything." "Doesn't it bother you, being talked about?" "Can't control what people say, can only control what you do." Eleanor considered this while making another entry in the ledger. It was a simple philosophy, almost too simple, but there was wisdom in it. The afternoon wore on. At some point, Silas brought more coffee and disappeared again. Eleanor's back started aching from hunching over the table, but she kept working. There was something almost meditative about it, the scratch of pen on paper, the rustle of documents being sorted, the occasional pop from the fire. Around 5, Rook stood abruptly. "Enough. You'll go blind working in this light." Eleanor looked up and realized he was right. The daylight had faded to gray, and she'd been straining to read for the last hour without noticing. "I can light a lamp." "No, work's done for today." "But there's still so much, and it'll still be there tomorrow." He had a point. Dinner was a communal affair. The table got cleared. Eleanor tried not to wince as her carefully organized piles were temporarily relocated, and Silas brought out food that was simple but substantial. Roasted venison, potatoes, some kind of bread that was dense and filling. They were joined by 2 other men Eleanor hadn't met yet. Martin, who turned out to be younger than she'd expected with a face that suggested he smiled more easily than the others, and Jacob, who was older and quieter and watched Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. "So you're the one who's going to make sense of the boss's mess," Martin said cheerfully. "I'm going to try." "Good luck. I once spent 3 hours trying to figure out his filing system. Turns out there wasn't one. He just put things wherever there was space." Rook didn't deny this. The conversation flowed easily, mostly between Martin and Silas, with occasional contributions from Jacob. Rook barely spoke, but Eleanor noticed he listened. Really listened. When Martin mentioned a problem with one of the trap lines, Rook's attention sharpened immediately. When Jacob complained about a loose board in the timber shed, Rook made a mental note that Eleanor could practically see him filing away. "How are you finding it up here?" Jacob asked Eleanor directly. "Different from what I'm used to." "Different good or different bad?" "Just different. I haven't decided yet." Martin laughed. "Honest answer. Most people lie and say they love it, then disappear after a week. Has that happened often? 3 times, Silas said. Boss had a woman from town come up to help with cooking and cleaning. Lasted 4 days. Then he hired a clerk who was supposed to organize the books. Made it 2 weeks. Then there was that fellow who was going to help with the trading side. He left after 1 day. What happened? The men exchanged glances. Boss happened, Martin said finally. He's not good with people. Doesn't know how to... He gestured vaguely. You know, small talk, pleasantries, making someone feel comfortable. I don't have time for that nonsense, Rook said flatly. See what I mean? Eleanor did see, but she also saw something else. Rook wasn't good with people because he didn't understand the social games everyone else played. The polite lies, the false enthusiasm, the performance of normalcy. In that way, they were more alike than she'd thought. After dinner, Eleanor helped clear the table and then retreated to her room. The stove had gone cold, so she relit it and sat in the growing warmth, watching darkness settle over the valley through the small window. Her second night in the mountains. It still felt surreal. She thought about Mrs. Donnelly and the other boarders, probably wondering if she was dead in a ditch somewhere. She thought about Thomas Pritchard and his rejection. She thought about her father in Boston, who'd washed his hands of her when she'd refused to be the dutiful daughter he'd wanted. All those people who'd measured her worth and found her lacking. And here she was, 6 miles up a mountain, working for a man who'd looked at her exactly once and said, essentially, can you do the job? Not, are you pretty enough? Are you small enough? Are you feminine enough? Are you the right shape to fit into society's expectations? Just, can you do the work? Eleanor found herself smiling in the darkness. Maybe she'd finally found a place where being too much was exactly enough. The next morning, Silas drove her back to town to collect her things. The ride down was easier than the ride up had been, probably because Eleanor knew what to expect now, or maybe because she was leaving rather than arriving. Mrs. Donnelly was horrified to see her. Eleanor Vance, I've been worried sick. You disappear into the mountains with a strange man and don't send word? I was about to organize a search party. I'm sorry, I should have sent a message, but I'm fine. Actually, I'm employed. That stopped Mrs. Donnelly's tirade. You're what? Employed, working for Mr. Rook. I'm living up there now. The expression on Mrs. Donnelly's face suggested Eleanor had announced plans to join a circus. You can't be serious. Completely serious. Eleanor, you don't know anything about this man. I know he's offered me fair pay for honest work. That's more than anyone in this town was willing to do. Eleanor packed her belongings, which didn't take long since she hadn't unpacked much to begin with, and settled her account with Mrs. Donnelly, who continued objecting throughout the entire process. If you need help, she said as Eleanor prepared to leave, if anything happens up there, I'll send word. I promise. The other boarders had gathered to say goodbye. Miss Collins pressed a book into Eleanor's hands. Something to read on long evenings, she said, and come visit when you can. I want to hear how this adventure turns out. Eleanor promised she would. The ride back up the mountain felt different, like going home, which was ridiculous because she'd been there less than 48 hours. But something about the increasing altitude, the thinning air, the way civilization fell away behind them, it felt right in a way Boston never had. Silas glanced at her as they climbed. You settling in okay? I think so. Boss can be difficult, so I've heard. But he's fair, and once he trusts you, he's loyal to a fault. Seen him take a loss rather than go back on his word. Seen him stand up for people who wouldn't do the same for him. Eleanor looked at Silas. Why are you telling me this? Because you're the first person who's lasted more than a few days. Thought you might want to know what you're getting into. They reached the valley as afternoon light was starting to slant through the trees. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon, carried her suitcase upstairs, and unpacked properly this time. Hung her dresses in the small wardrobe, arranged her few personal items on the dresser, made the space feel lived in rather than temporary. Then she went downstairs and got back to work. Rook was at the table, frowning at a map. Problem? Eleanor asked, trying to figure out the best route for the spring timber operation. Every option has drawbacks. Eleanor looked at the map. It was hand-drawn, detailed, showing terrain features she couldn't interpret. What are the options? He explained. Route 1 was shorter but steep. Route 2 was gentler but crossed a river that might be running high in spring. Route 3 avoided both problems but added significant distance. What did you do last year? Route 2 lost 3 days when the river flooded. And the year before? Route 1 lost a wagon when it couldn't handle the grade. Eleanor studied the map, thinking, what if you split the difference? Use Route 1 for light loads when you can manage the slope. Route 2 when water levels are safe. Route 3 is backup. Rook looked at her. That's more complicated. Yes, but more flexible. You're not locked into one choice that might turn out wrong. He considered this, then nodded slowly. I'll think about it. Eleanor returned to the bookkeeping, but she was starting to realize that her job here wasn't just about organizing paperwork. Rook wanted someone who could think, problem solve, see patterns and possibilities he might miss. That was interesting. That was challenging. That was exactly what she'd been looking for without knowing it. The days developed a rhythm. Eleanor would wake early, work through the morning on correspondence and bookkeeping, break for the midday meal, continue working through the afternoon, then join the others for dinner and whatever evening activities presented themselves. Sometimes it was just quiet conversation. Sometimes Martin would tell stories about his trap lines that were probably exaggerated but entertaining. Sometimes Jacob would work on equipment repairs while the others watched and offered occasionally useful suggestions. Rook mostly listened, but every so often he'd contribute something, a dry observation, a correction to Martin's wilder claims, a solution to whatever problem Jacob was wrestling with. And slowly, Eleanor began to understand how this place worked. It wasn't about hierarchy exactly, though Rook was clearly in charge. It was more like a collective. Everyone had their role. Everyone contributed what they could, and the success of the operation depended on all of them doing their parts competently. It was nothing like Boston, where success meant climbing social ladders and impressing the right people and fitting into rigid expectations. Here, success was simpler. Do your work. Pull your weight. Don't create problems for others. Eleanor found she was good at that. By the end of her first week, she'd organized the correspondence, created a functioning filing system, and brought the ledgers up to date. The coordinated trap order had gotten a positive response from the Denver supplier, and she'd identified 3 billing errors that had cost Rook nearly $200 over the past 6 months. You're staying, Rook said one evening after dinner. It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. If you'll have me. 2-week trial's over. You've proven you can do the work. Then yes, I'm staying. Something that might have been satisfaction crossed his face. Good. That night, Eleanor lay in her bed listening to the wind in the trees and realized something that should have been obvious from the start. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Rook. Not of the isolation. Not of the future. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Winter deepened, and Eleanor discovered what cold actually meant. The kind of cold that made the logs in the walls crack like gunshots in the middle of the night. The kind that turned her breath to ice crystals on the inside of her window. The kind that made every trip to the outhouse feel like a life-threatening expedition. She also discovered she didn't mind it as much as she'd expected. There was something honest about winter in the mountains. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. Brutal, yes. Unforgiving, absolutely. But also clean, pure. No false promises. The work expanded to fill her days. What had started as simple bookkeeping evolved into something larger. Rook started asking her opinion on business decisions, which suppliers to trust, whether to extend credit to a trapper who'd had a bad season, how to price goods when the market fluctuated. Eleanor found she had opinions about all of it. You're thinking about this wrong, she told him one afternoon in early December. They were reviewing a proposal from a timber company that wanted to contract for spring delivery. Rook looked up from the letter he'd been struggling through. How so? They're offering a flat rate per board foot, but lumber prices vary seasonally. If you lock in now at their price and the market goes up in spring, you lose money. And if the market goes down, I'm protected. True. But look at the trend over the past 3 years. Eleanor pulled out the records she'd organized. Prices always spike in April and May when construction season starts. Always. So you're essentially betting against a pattern that's held steady for years. Rook studied the numbers she'd laid out. His reading had improved over the weeks. Eleanor had noticed him working through documents more quickly, though he still sometimes asked her to clarify complicated passages. "What would you do?" he asked. "Counteroffer. Agree to the contract but with a price adjustment clause tied to market rates in April. You take on slightly more risk, but you also don't cap your profit potential." They might not accept that. They might not, but right now you hold the leverage. They need timber, and you're one of the few suppliers who can deliver the quality and quantity they want. Make them negotiate. Rook leaned back in his chair, which protested with its usual ominous creaking. "You're good at this." "At what?" "Seeing angles. Most people just take what's offered. You look for what's not being said." Eleanor felt heat rise to her face, which was ridiculous. It was just an observation, but something about the way he said it, with that absolute certainty, like he was stating a fact as obvious as the color of the sky, made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced before. "I spent a lot of years watching people negotiate," she said. "You learn things when you're tall enough that everyone forgets you're in the room." "They're idiots, then." "Excuse me? Anyone who'd overlook you because of your height is an idiot. That's my professional assessment." Eleanor laughed before she could stop herself. "Your professional assessment?" "I'm a businessman. I assess things. Professionally." The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. It was the first time Eleanor had seen anything resembling humor from him, and it transformed his face completely. Made him look younger, less severe, more human. The moment passed quickly. Rook returned his attention to the timber contract, and Eleanor went back to entering receipts in the ledger. But something had shifted between them. Some barrier had thinned. That evening, Martin came back from checking trap lines with news that sent a ripple of tension through the dinner table. "Saw some men from the railroad survey team," he said, helping himself to the venison stew Silas had made. "About 3 miles east of here." Rook's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "How many?" 4, maybe 5. They were marking trees." "Our trees?" "Hard to say. They were right on the boundary line." Jacob swore quietly. Silas's expression went flat and dangerous. Eleanor looked between them, trying to understand the significance. "What's the railroad survey team?" she asked. "Company that's planning to push a rail line through this territory," Rook said. His voice was carefully neutral, but Eleanor had learned to read the tension in his shoulders. He was angry. "They've been surveying routes for the past year. And that's a problem because if they decide to run the line through this valley, they can claim eminent domain," Jacob said. "Government backs them. They take what they want, pay what they decide is fair, and there's not much anyone can do about it." Eleanor set down her spoon. "They can just take your land." "It's not that simple," Rook said. "But yeah, basically. If they can prove the route serves public interest and this is the best location, they can force a sale." "That's outrageous. That's progress." The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. "Or that's what they call it, anyway." Martin pushed food around his plate. "They were pretty far from the main survey route, though. Might just be checking alternatives. Or might be they've decided on this valley and they're getting ready to move." Rook stood abruptly. "I'll ride out tomorrow, see what they're actually doing." "I'll come with you," Silas said. "No, need you here working on the harnesses. I'll take Eleanor." That stopped all conversation. Eleanor looked up, startled. "Me? You're better with words than any of us. If there's talking to be done, you should do it." "I don't know anything about railroad surveys or property law." "You know how to listen, how to ask the right questions. That's what matters." Eleanor wanted to argue, but the logic was sound, and there was something else in his expression. Not quite trust, but an expectation of competence that she found herself unwilling to disappoint. "All right," she said. "What time do we leave?" "First light." Morning came cold and gray. Eleanor dressed in layers, her wool dress over 2 petticoats, her heaviest coat, a scarf Mrs. Donnelly had pressed on her during that last visit to town. She looked ridiculous, but she'd learned that vanity froze to death quickly in the mountains. Rook was already in the barn when she got there, saddling 2 horses. He glanced at her outfit and nodded approval. "You'll want these too." He handed her a pair of gloves that were far too large but lined with fur that felt like heaven against her skin. "Whose are these?" "Mine. But I've got others." Eleanor pulled them on, touched by the gesture, even though Rook's expression suggested it was purely practical. The horses were massive creatures that made Eleanor nervous despite her attempts to hide it. She'd ridden exactly 3 times in her life, all of them in Boston's manicured parks on horses so gentle they were practically furniture. These were not those horses. "This is May," Rook said, indicating the slightly smaller of the two. "She's steady, won't spook. Just hold the reins light and let her follow Goliath." Goliath was apparently the name of Rook's horse, which was fitting because the animal looked like it could carry a building. Mounting was awkward. Eleanor's dress caught, she nearly lost her balance, and she ended up in the saddle with all the grace of a sack of potatoes. But she was up, and May didn't seem to mind her incompetence, so that was something. They rode out as the sun was just starting to edge above the eastern mountains. The valley was still in shadow, cold and quiet except for the crunch of snow under the horses' hooves. Eleanor focused on staying balanced and not falling off, which occupied most of her attention for the first mile. Then the rhythm of it started to feel less foreign. May had an easy gait, and if Eleanor relaxed instead of fighting for control, the movement became almost natural. Rook rode slightly ahead, his focus on the trail and the surrounding forest. He didn't speak, but Eleanor was learning that his silences weren't uncomfortable. They were just his default state. Words for Rook weren't casual currency. They were tools used when necessary and set aside when they weren't. After about an hour, he slowed Goliath and gestured for Eleanor to come alongside. "Boundary's just ahead," he said quietly. "Property line runs along that ridge. Everything on this side is mine. Everything past it is public land." Eleanor looked at the ridge. It didn't seem like much, just another rise in the endless series of rises and valleys that made up this landscape. "How do you know exactly where the line is?" "Surveyed it myself when I bought the land. Got the documentation filed with the territorial office. It's legal and it's clear. But if the railroad wants it, then we fight. Within the law if possible. Outside it if necessary." That should have alarmed Eleanor. Instead, she found it oddly reassuring. Rook wasn't someone who'd surrender just because the opposition had money and influence. He'd stand his ground. They crested the ridge and Eleanor saw the survey team immediately. 4 men clustered around what looked like surveying equipment, taking measurements and making notes. They hadn't noticed Rook and Eleanor yet, too absorbed in their work. "Let me do the talking first," Rook said. "Jump in if I'm about to say something stupid." "How will I know?" "You'll know." They rode down toward the group. One of the men looked up, saw them coming, and said something to the others. By the time Rook and Eleanor reached them, all 4 were standing in a defensive cluster, hands hovering near weapons that Eleanor hoped they wouldn't actually use. "Morning," Rook said, his voice carrying that particular flatness that meant he was working to sound civil. "You boys are pretty far from the main survey route." The man who seemed to be in charge, older, better dressed, carrying himself with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed, stepped forward. "We're conducting a comprehensive survey of potential routes. This valley represents a viable alternative to the primary corridor. This valley is private property. We're aware. We're currently on public land conducting assessments. We haven't crossed any boundary lines." Rook's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "What kind of assessments? Topographical analysis, gradient calculations, structural viability for railroad construction." Eleanor cleared her throat softly. Rook glanced at her, and she took that as permission. "I'm Eleanor Vance," she said, keeping her tone professional. "I manage business affairs for Mr. Rook. Can you tell us what factors would make this valley preferable to the primary route?" The surveyor looked her up and down with obvious surprise. Whatever he'd expected to find out here, a well-spoken woman apparently wasn't it. The primary route requires 3 significant bridges and extensive grading through unstable terrain. This valley offers a more direct path with fewer engineering challenges. "At the cost of crossing private property," Eleanor said. "Private property can be acquired. Through eminent domain. If necessary, yes." Eleanor felt Rook tense beside her. She continued quickly, before he could say something that would escalate the situation. "What's your timeline for making a decision on the route?" "The survey needs to be completed by spring. Final determinations will be made by the Railroad Company Board after reviewing all options. And if they choose this valley, then we'll initiate the appropriate legal processes for land acquisition." At prices the railroad determines are fair. The surveyor's expression hardened. At prices determined by independent assessment in accordance with territorial law, which the railroad influences through political connections and financial leverage. Miss Vance, I don't appreciate the implication, but I'm not implying anything, Eleanor said calmly. I'm stating facts. The railroad has significant political influence. Land assessments in these situations tend to favor the company's interests over the property owners. These are documented patterns. Rook was staring at her now, but Eleanor kept her focus on the surveyor. We're not interested in selling, she continued, at any price. So whatever report you file should include that information. Mr. Rook's property is not available for acquisition, voluntary or otherwise. Everyone has a price, Miss Vance. No, Rook said quietly. We don't. The surveyor looked between them, clearly reassessing. The railroad will do what's necessary to complete this line. If this valley is the best route, opposition from one property owner won't stop it. Maybe not, Eleanor said, but it will delay it, create complications, generate legal costs and public relations problems. Is this route actually significantly better than the alternatives, or is it just marginally more convenient? Silence. The surveyor's expression suggested she'd hit closer to the truth than he'd like. I'll include your opposition in my report, he said finally. We'd appreciate that, Eleanor said. We'd also appreciate notification of any future surveys on or near this property. Mr. Rook is happy to cooperate with reasonable requests, but unannounced activities make everyone nervous. I'll note that as well. It wasn't much, but it was something. A slight shift from confrontation toward negotiation. Eleanor could work with that. The ride back was quiet until they were well out of earshot of the survey team. Then Rook spoke. That was impressive. I didn't really do anything. You kept me from threatening them, which is what I was about to do. And you made them think twice about whether pushing through here is worth the trouble. He paused. Where'd you learn to talk like that? Like what? Like someone who's done this before. Negotiations. Dealing with people who have power. Eleanor thought about her father's study. The countless evenings she'd spent quietly working on his correspondence while he met with clients, business partners, politicians. How she'd absorbed the rhythms of negotiation without even realizing it. I paid attention, she said simply. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. The sun had climbed higher, turning the snow brilliant white and making Eleanor squint against the glare. The cold was intense, but the exercise of riding kept her warm enough. Can I ask you something? Eleanor said eventually. Rook nodded. Why did you really buy this land? It's beautiful, but it's also incredibly isolated and the winters are brutal. You could run your business from somewhere more accessible. He was quiet for so long Eleanor thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, I was in the army. Did Silas tell you that? No. Figured he might have. Most people around here know. I was a scout during the Western campaigns. Good at it too. Could move quiet, read terrain, find things people didn't want found. His hands tightened on the reins. But armies aren't just about scouts. They're about following orders. Doing things because someone with more rank tells you to do them, even when those things are wrong. Eleanor waited. I saw things I wish I hadn't seen, did things I'm not proud of. When my term ended, I came out here looking for space, distance from all that, found this valley, and it was... He gestured at the landscape around them. Quiet. No orders. No expectations. Just land that didn't care what I'd done or who I'd been. So you stayed. Built something that was mine. Something that couldn't be taken away by someone else's decisions. Eleanor understood that impulse more than he probably realized. The need to build something outside the systems that had failed you. And now the railroad wants to take it anyway, she said. Yeah. We won't let them. Rook looked at her. We? I'm your business manager. Your business includes keeping your land, therefore keeping the railroad from taking your land is part of my job. Something that might have been gratitude crossed his face. Didn't realize that was in your job description. I'm expanding my responsibilities. Consider it a promotion I'm giving myself. That got an actual smile from him. Small, brief, but genuine. They reached the valley as afternoon was fading toward evening. Silas met them at the barn, clearly anxious for news. Railroad's considering this valley as an alternative route, Rook said, dismounting. They haven't decided yet, but they're surveying seriously. Silas swore with impressive creativity. Eleanor convinced them we'd be trouble if they try to push through, Rook added. How much trouble? Legal trouble mostly. Public relations problems. Delays. Eleanor climbed down from May with slightly more grace than she'd mounted. Nothing that will stop them if they're determined, but enough to make them think carefully about whether it's worth it. So what do? We document everything, Eleanor said. Every survey they do, every interaction we have with them, every piece of correspondence. We build a record that shows they had other options and chose this valley for convenience rather than necessity. And we find allies, other landowners, local politicians, anyone with influence who might oppose the railroad's expansion. That's a lot of work, Silas said. Yes, but it's better than the alternative. Over the next weeks, Eleanor threw herself into what she privately thought of as the railroad problem. She wrote letters to the Territorial Land Office requesting copies of all survey records and route proposals. She researched eminent domain law using the limited legal texts Rook had acquired over the years. She drafted a formal objection to any potential land acquisition and filed it with every relevant government office she could identify. The responses were slow in coming. Everything moved slowly in winter when mail had to be carried by riders through mountain passes that were often impassable. But Eleanor was patient. She'd learned patience the hard way, sitting in Boston parlors while people discussed her height and her prospects as if she wasn't there. This kind of fighting she understood. Christmas came and went with minimal fanfare. Martin brought back a small pine tree from one of his trap runs, and the men decorated it with whatever they could find. Strips of leather, carved wooden ornaments, one sad string of popcorn that looked like it had been made years ago and carefully preserved. Eleanor contributed handkerchiefs she'd embroidered during evening hours when the bookkeeping was done. Simple designs. Pine trees for the men who worked outside, a ledger for Rook since that made him laugh, which was becoming one of Eleanor's favorite sounds. Rook gave her a coat. Not one of his old ones altered to fit, though that would have been practical. An actual coat made specifically for her height and build, heavy wool lined with fur, with pockets deep enough to be useful and sleeves that actually reached her wrists. How did you... Eleanor started, then stopped. When did you have time to arrange this? Silas took measurements when you weren't paying attention, Rook said. Sent them to a tailor in Denver 3 weeks ago. Figured you needed something better than what you had. Eleanor ran her hands over the fabric, throat tight. It was the most thoughtful gift anyone had ever given her. Not because it was expensive, though it clearly was, but because it acknowledged something simple and profound. She existed at her actual size, and that was fine. Thank you, she managed. Try it on. She did. It fit perfectly. The shoulders sat right, the length was exactly correct. And when she moved, the coat moved with her instead of pulling or binding. For the first time in her life, Eleanor wore a coat that actually fit. She cried about it later, alone in her room, and felt only mildly embarrassed about the tears. January brought storms that made December's cold look friendly by comparison. Snow piled high enough that getting from the main house to the barn required shoveling a path twice daily. The wind howled through the valley like something alive and angry. Temperatures dropped so low that water left in a cup overnight froze solid. They were trapped inside for days at a time. Eleanor had expected this kind of isolation to feel oppressive. Instead, she found it almost companionable. The 5 of them, Rook, Silas, Jacob, Martin, and Eleanor, developed routines that made the small space bearable. Jacob carved. Martin repaired equipment. Silas cooked elaborate meals that were probably his way of fighting boredom. Rook read. Eleanor watched this development with fascination. The man who'd struggled through simple letters when she'd first arrived was now working his way through actual books. He read slowly, finger tracking under the lines, sometimes moving his lips as he worked through complicated words. But he persisted. One evening, Eleanor looked up from the supply inventory she was updating to find Rook frowning at a page. Problem? She asked. This word, he pointed. Eleanor leaned over. Requisition. What's it mean? A formal request for something, usually in a military or business context. He nodded, returning to his reading. 5 minutes later, and this one? Procurement. It means obtaining something, usually through purchase. This pattern repeated for an hour. Rook reading, occasionally asking for help, Eleanor providing definitions without judgment or commentary. It felt intimate in a way she hadn't expected, like he was trusting her with something vulnerable. "Can I ask what you're reading?" Eleanor said finally. He showed her the book. It was a treatise on contract law. "For the railroad thing?" she asked. "Want to understand what they can and can't do legally. Figured I should read the actual law instead of just trusting what people say about it." Eleanor felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Rook was preparing for a fight he didn't want, educating himself on topics that didn't come naturally to him because he refused to surrender without understanding exactly what he was up against. "That's smart," she said. "It's slow. Doesn't matter. You're doing it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Eleanor saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. The same thing she'd felt that first day when he'd looked at her and seen someone who could do a job, not someone who was too tall to fit. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I am." The moment stretched between them, fragile and significant, until Martin dropped a pan in the kitchen and the crash broke whatever spell had been forming. But Eleanor felt it lingering for the rest of the evening. A shift, a change. Something building between them that was more than employer and employee, more than simple friendship. She wasn't sure what to do with that feeling, so she did what she always did when confused. She worked. February arrived with slightly warmer temperatures, and the first signs that winter might eventually release its grip. The mail started moving again, and with it came Eleanor's responses from the territorial offices. The news wasn't good. The railroad had filed preliminary route plans that included Rook's Valley as the primary option. They cited superior engineering feasibility and reduced construction costs. The territorial governor, who apparently had significant financial ties to the railroad company, had endorsed the route in a public statement. Eleanor read the documents 3 times, looking for any weakness, any angle they could exploit. "How bad?" Rook asked. He was standing behind her, reading over her shoulder. "Bad. They've got political support at the highest levels. The engineering reports favor this route, and they've already started the legal process for land assessment." Meaning in about 6 months they'll make a formal offer for your land. You can refuse, but then they'll petition for eminent domain. Given the governor's support, that petition will likely be approved. Rook's hands clenched into fists. "So we've already lost." "No." Eleanor stood, turning to face him. "We've just learned what we're actually fighting. That's different from losing." "Eleanor, listen to me. They have advantages, yes. Political connections, legal precedent, financial resources. But they also have vulnerabilities. Public opinion matters, especially in territories trying to achieve statehood. If we can make this look like a land grab by a corrupt company backed by a corrupt governor, we might be able to generate enough opposition to slow them down." "Slow them down isn't stop them." "No, but slow them down buys us time to find other options." "What other options?" Eleanor didn't have an answer to that yet, but she'd find one. She had to. That night she lay awake in her room listening to the wind and thinking about everything she'd built in the past few months. The work she was proud of, the community she'd found, the man who'd given her a coat that fit and trusted her with words he didn't understand. The railroad wanted to take all of that away. Eleanor had spent her entire life being told she was too much, too tall, too difficult to accommodate. She'd been pushed aside and dismissed and rejected by people who should have valued her. She was done accepting that. If the railroad wanted Rook's land, they were going to have to go through her first. And Eleanor Vance, all 6 feet of her, wasn't moving. Spring arrived tentatively, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. Snow melted in patches, leaving the valley floor a mess of mud and ice and dead vegetation that hadn't seen sunlight in months. The sound of dripping water was constant, from the roof, from trees, from icicles surrendering to temperatures that finally climbed above freezing. Eleanor hated mud. It got everywhere. Caked on boots, splattered on hems, turned the path between buildings into a treacherous obstacle course. But it also meant winter was loosening its grip, and with spring came the possibility of action instead of just planning. The railroad's formal offer arrived on a Tuesday in mid-March. Silas brought the mail up from town, a stack of letters and packages, and one official-looking envelope with the railroad company's seal. Eleanor signed for it with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. She waited until after dinner to open it, wanting Rook and the others present. They gathered around the table while Eleanor broke the seal and pulled out thick pages of legal documentation. "Well?" Martin asked after she'd been silent for several minutes. "They're offering $1,200 for the entire property." Jacob whistled low. "That's insulting." "That's calculated," Eleanor corrected. "They've assessed the land value at $800 and added $400 as a good faith premium to encourage voluntary sale. It's structured to look generous while actually being well below market value." "How much below?" Rook asked. His voice was calm, but Eleanor could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. "Based on comparable sales in the territory over the past 2 years, this property should be valued at $3,000 minimum, probably closer to $4,000 given the timber resources and water access." "So they're trying to rob me?" "They're trying to acquire your land as cheaply as possible while maintaining a legal fiction of fairness." Silas leaned back in his chair. "What happens if the boss refuses?" Eleanor consulted the documents. "We have 30 days to respond. If we refuse, they'll initiate eminent domain proceedings. That means a territorial judge will hold a hearing to determine if the taking serves public interest and if their compensation is adequate." "And the judge will be in their pocket," Jacob said flatly. "Maybe. Probably. But we still have to go through the process." Rook stood abruptly and walked to the window. He stood there for a long moment, staring out at the valley that was slowly emerging from winter. The valley he'd built a life in. The valley the railroad wanted to take. "Write the refusal," he said finally. "Rook," Silas started. "Write it. We're not selling. Not for $1,200, not for $4,000, not for any amount. This is my land. I built everything here. They can't just take it because it's convenient for them." Eleanor pulled out paper and pen. "I'll draft something tonight, but you need to understand, refusing starts a legal battle we might not win. Then we lose fighting. That's better than just handing it over." Nobody argued with that. Eleanor spent the next 3 days crafting a refusal that was professional, legally sound, and made it absolutely clear they would contest every step of the eminent domain process. She cited precedents, questioned the railroad's necessity claims, and requested full disclosure of alternative routes and their associated costs. "Think it'll do any good?" Rook asked, reading the final version. "It'll delay them, make them work for it. That's about all we can hope for right now." The response came faster than Eleanor expected, 10 days instead of the usual weeks. The railroad's lawyers acknowledged their refusal and confirmed that eminent domain proceedings would commence. A hearing was scheduled for late May. 2 months to prepare. Eleanor threw herself into research with an intensity that surprised even her. She wrote to lawyers in Denver and San Francisco, seeking advice on eminent domain cases. She contacted other landowners who'd fought railroad takings, gathering information about what had worked and what hadn't. She compiled documentation of every aspect of Rook's business: property improvements, revenue generation, employment of local workers. Anything that might demonstrate the taking would cause substantial harm beyond simple property loss. Rook watched this flurry of activity with something between appreciation and concern. "You're going to work yourself sick," he said one evening, finding Eleanor still at the table long after everyone else had gone to bed. "I'm fine." "Eleanor, it's past midnight. You've been at this for 16 hours. There's too much to do, and it'll still be there tomorrow." He pulled out the chair next to her and sat down. "Talk to me. What's driving this?" Eleanor set down her pen. The honest answer felt too raw, too revealing. But Rook had trusted her with his vulnerabilities. Maybe she owed him the same. "All my life, people have taken things from me because they had the power to do it. My father decided I was too expensive to support, so he cut me off. Society decided I didn't fit their standards, so they excluded me. Thomas Pritchard decided I wasn't what he wanted, so he rejected me." She met Rook's eyes. "I couldn't fight any of that. I just had to accept it and move on. But this, the railroad trying to take your land, this I can fight. Maybe not successfully, but I can try. And that matters." Rook was quiet for a long moment. Then, "This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is. You gave me a place when nobody else would. A job, a home, respect. The railroad taking that away makes it my fight whether you like it or not." "Eleanor, I'm not leaving, Rook. You can tell me to stop working so hard, fine, but you can't make me stop caring about what happens here." Something shifted in his expression, softened. Wasn't going to ask you to leave. Was going to say thank you for caring, for fighting, for... He gestured vaguely, struggling for words. For being here. The moment stretched between them, heavy with things neither of them quite knew how to say. Then Rook stood. Get some sleep. We've got 2 months. That's enough time if we're smart about it. Eleanor nodded and gathered her papers. As she headed for the stairs, Rook spoke again. Eleanor? She turned. The coat still fit right? Despite everything, she smiled. Perfectly. Good. That's good. She climbed the stairs feeling something warm settle in her chest. Something that had nothing to do with the fight ahead and everything to do with the man who'd asked about her coat with the awkward sincerity of someone who wasn't used to caring about people. April brought a different kind of complication. Eleanor was in town picking up supplies and mail when she literally ran into Thomas Pritchard coming out of the general store. He stumbled backward, apologizing automatically, then froze when he saw who'd bumped into him. Miss Vance? Mr. Pritchard. Eleanor kept her voice neutral. He looked different than she remembered, smaller somehow, though he was the same physical height he'd always been. She realized with the start that it was her perception that had changed. After months with Rook and the others, Thomas Pritchard seemed diminished. I heard you were working up in the mountains, he said. I am. For that Rook fellow. For Mr. Rook, yes. An awkward silence stretched out. Thomas shifted his weight, clearly wrestling with something. Finally, I owe you an apology. That Eleanor hadn't expected. For what happened at the station, he continued, the way I reacted when you arrived, it was ungentlemanly and unkind. It was honest, Eleanor said. I appreciate that more than false courtesy would have been worth. Still, I've thought about it quite a bit over these past months, how I must have made you feel, the position I left you in. He paused. I heard you've done well for yourself, that you're managing Rook's business affairs. I am. That's good. You're clearly talented at that sort of thing, much more suited to it than being a shopkeeper's wife. There it was, the backhanded compliment that simultaneously acknowledged her abilities, while suggesting she was somehow unsuited for traditional domestic life. Eleanor had heard variations of it her entire life. I'm suited to exactly what I choose to be suited for, she said evenly, just like everyone else. Thomas blinked. Of course, I didn't mean... Mr. Pritchard, I appreciate the apology, truly. But let's not pretend your rejection was anything other than what it was. You wanted a wife who fit a certain image, and I didn't fit it. That's your prerogative, but you don't get to rewrite it as somehow being for my benefit. I wasn't trying to... Yes, you were. And I'm telling you, it's not necessary. We're both fine. You found someone more suitable, I assume? Actually, I did. Mary Patterson. We're engaged. Congratulations. I hope you'll be happy together. Eleanor meant it sincerely, but Thomas looked uncertain, like he couldn't tell if she was being sarcastic. The reason I mention it, he said, is that Mary's father is on the territorial council. He's involved in the railroad matter. I heard about the dispute over Rook's land. Eleanor's attention sharpened. What about it? Just that there's significant pressure from the governor's office to move the process along quickly. The railroad has friends in high places, Miss Vance. Fighting them might be futile. Are you warning me or threatening me? Warning. I don't wish you ill despite how things ended between us, but you should know what you're up against. Eleanor studied him. He seemed genuine, though his motives were unclear. Maybe guilt, maybe legitimate concern, maybe just a desire to seem helpful. I appreciate the warning, she said, but we're not backing down. Thomas sighed. I figured you'd say that. You always were stubborn. I prefer determined. It's the same thing. Not even remotely. Almost laughter flickered across his face. Mary's nothing like you. She's quiet, biddable, fits perfectly into all the spaces a wife should fit. Then you chose well. Did I? The question seemed to escape him without permission. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Mr. Pritchard, I sincerely hope you and Miss Patterson will be happy, but I need to get these supplies back up the mountain before dark. Of course. Good luck with the railroad thing. Thank you. Eleanor left him standing there and loaded her purchases onto the wagon Silas had let her borrow. As she drove out of town, she found herself thinking about Thomas Pritchard and his quiet, biddable fiancée, who fit perfectly into expected spaces. There was a time when Eleanor would have envied that, would have wished she could shrink herself down to fit into those spaces too. But that time had passed. She'd found different spaces now, ones she didn't have to shrink to occupy. The hearing date loomed closer, and Eleanor's anxiety grew proportionally. She'd done everything she could to prepare, gathered documentation, researched precedents, compiled evidence of alternative routes. But none of it mattered if the judge was already decided. "We need a lawyer," she told Rook 2 weeks before the hearing. "Someone who knows territorial law and has courtroom experience." "Can't afford a good lawyer." "We can't afford not to have one." Rook ran his hand through his hair, a gesture Eleanor had learned meant he was frustrated. "The legal fees alone could bankrupt the operation, and if we lose anyway, we're out the land and the money. If we don't fight properly, we lose for certain." They were at an impasse, both knowing they needed legal representation, both aware they couldn't really afford it. The solution came from an unexpected source. Jacob had a cousin in Denver who'd gone to law school back east and recently hung out a shingle in the territorial capital. The cousin, a young man named Samuel Warren, had more idealism than sense and agreed to take the case for a fee they could almost manage. He arrived a week before the hearing, riding up to the valley on a horse that looked as uncertain about the whole situation as its rider. Samuel Warren was thin, pale, and looked like a strong wind might blow him over. But his eyes were sharp, and when Eleanor showed him her research, he actually smiled. "This is excellent work, better than most of what I see from trained lawyers." "Will it be enough?" "Honestly, probably not. The railroad has money, political connections, and legal precedent on their side. But we can make them work for it, and sometimes making powerful people work harder than they expected is its own kind of victory." It wasn't the reassurance Eleanor had hoped for, but it was realistic. She appreciated that. The night before they were supposed to leave for the hearing, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed listening to the night sounds of the valley and thought about everything that was at stake. Around midnight, she gave up and went downstairs. Found Rook sitting at the table with the contract law book he'd been working through all spring. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "Nope." Eleanor sat down across from him. "Want to talk about it?" "Not much to say. Tomorrow we go fight a battle we'll probably lose." "We might not lose." Rook gave her a look that suggested he appreciated the optimism, but didn't share it. "What will you do if they take it?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Don't know. Start over somewhere else, I guess. Though finding another place like this..." He trailed off, looking around the room that had been his home for years. "This valley is the first place I felt like I could breathe right, like the world wasn't pressing in on all sides." Eleanor understood that feeling viscerally. "What about you?" Rook asked. "If we lose, what will you do?" The question hit Eleanor harder than she'd expected. She'd been so focused on the fight that she hadn't really considered what came after defeat. "I don't know," she admitted. "Go back to town, I suppose. Try to find other work." "You could come with me. If I relocate. Could use someone who knows the business." "Is that an offer?" "If you want it to be." Eleanor looked at him across the table. This huge, rough man who'd given her a chance when nobody else would. Who'd trusted her with his business and his vulnerabilities. Who'd learned to read better just so he could understand the laws that might take his home. "Yes," she said, "I'd want that." Something passed between them then. An acknowledgement of what they'd built together over the past months. Partnership, friendship, and maybe something deeper that neither of them quite knew how to name. "Should probably try to sleep," Rook said eventually. "Long day tomorrow." "Probably." Neither of them moved. "Eleanor?" "Yeah?" "I'm glad you stayed, after that first trial period. Glad you didn't go back to town." "Me too." They sat there a while longer in comfortable silence before finally retreating to their separate rooms. Eleanor still didn't sleep, but the anxious knot in her stomach had loosened slightly. Whatever happened tomorrow, at least she wouldn't face it alone. The territorial courthouse in Helena was more impressive than Eleanor had expected. A stone building with actual columns and windows that had real glass instead of oiled paper. It screamed official importance and institutional power. They arrived early, all of them. Rook, Eleanor, Samuel Warren, and Silas, who'd insisted on coming for moral support. They waited in a hallway that smelled of wood polish and old paper, while lawyers in expensive suits hurried past with armloads of documents. The railroad's legal team was impossible to miss. 4 lawyers, all of them older and more polished than Samuel. They glanced at Rook's group with barely concealed disdain. David versus Goliath, Samuel murmured. David won that fight, Eleanor pointed out. Only in the biblical version, real life tends to favor Goliath. The hearing itself was held in a room that felt designed to intimidate. High ceilings, dark wood, a judge's bench elevated above everyone else like a throne. Judge Morrison was in his 60s with steel gray hair and an expression suggesting he'd seen every variety of legal argument and wasn't impressed by most of them. The railroad's chief counsel presented their case first. He was smooth, practiced, hitting all the expected points: public interest in transportation infrastructure, economic benefits to the territory, thorough analysis of alternative routes showing this valley was superior in every measurable way. Fair compensation offered well above assessed value. He made it sound reasonable, inevitable, the natural progression of civilization requiring small sacrifices from individuals for the greater good. Then it was Samuel's turn. He stood, shuffled his papers nervously, and for a horrifying moment, Eleanor thought he was going to freeze. Then he looked at their documentation, straightened his shoulders, and spoke. Your Honor, the railroad's presentation makes this sound simple. A clear case of public need trumping private interest. But it's not that simple. Mr. Rook isn't just a landowner trying to extract maximum value. He's a businessman who's built a sustainable operation employing 6 people directly and supporting dozens of trappers and timber workers indirectly. Taking this land doesn't just impact him, it impacts an entire economic network. He walked the judge through Eleanor's documentation, the employment records, the business relationships, the improvements Rook had made to the property that increased its value far beyond the railroad's assessment. Furthermore, Samuel continued, warming to his subject, the railroad's claim that this route is necessary doesn't hold up under scrutiny. They have 3 viable alternative routes. He produced maps, compared cost analyses, pointed out that the difference between this valley and the alternatives was marginal at best. This isn't about necessity, Your Honor. It's about convenience. The railroad wants this route because it's slightly easier and slightly cheaper. But slightly easier doesn't meet the threshold for eminent domain. The law requires genuine public necessity, not just corporate preference. The railroad's lawyers objected, argued, cited precedents. Samuel countered each point with research Eleanor had compiled. It wasn't perfect. There were moments when he stumbled, times when the opposition's experience showed, but he fought hard. Judge Morrison listened to everything with the same impassive expression. When both sides had finished, he announced he'd issue his decision within 30 days and dismissed everyone. How did we do? Rook asked as they left the courthouse. Samuel grimaced. Better than I expected. Worse than I hoped. The judge seemed interested in our arguments about alternative routes, which is good, but he also didn't shut down the railroad's necessity claims, which is bad. So we wait. We wait. The month that followed was torture. Eleanor tried to focus on regular business. There were still accounts to manage, correspondence to handle, inventory to track. But her mind kept circling back to the hearing, replaying arguments, wondering if there was something else they should have said. Rook was quieter than usual, which was saying something. He threw himself into physical work, repairing fences, clearing deadfall, projects that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. 3 weeks in, Eleanor received a letter from her mother. She stared at the handwriting on the envelope for a full minute before opening it. Her mother had never written to her before. Their relationship had always been conducted through her father, with Eleanor's mother playing the role of disappointed observer to her daughter's failures. The letter was short. Eleanor, your father has informed me of your current situation and the legal difficulties regarding your employer's property. I have connections in Helena through the Ladies' Territorial Society. If you would like assistance, I may be able to provide it. Despite our differences, you are still my daughter. Mother. Eleanor read it 3 times, looking for the catch. The condition. The price that would make this offer of help into just another form of control. She couldn't find one. That evening, she showed the letter to Rook. You going to accept? He asked. I don't know. My mother doesn't do things without reasons. Usually reasons that benefit her. Maybe she just wants to help her daughter. You don't know my mother. No, but I know you, and you're the kind of person who fights for people. Maybe you get that from somewhere. It was an unexpectedly generous interpretation. Eleanor wasn't sure she bought it, but the possibility made her think. If she can actually help, Eleanor said slowly, then let her help. Pride's expensive, Eleanor. Can't afford it right now. Eleanor wrote back that night, accepting her mother's offer while making it clear she expected no strings attached. The response came within a week. Her mother would reach out to certain influential women in Helena who might have the judge's ear through their husbands. It felt uncomfortably like the kind of behind-the-scenes manipulation Eleanor had always hated. But Rook was right. They couldn't afford Pride. The decision arrived on a Thursday. Silas brought it up from town with the rest of the mail. Eleanor knew what it was the moment she saw the official seal. Her hand shook as she opened it. She read it once, then again, then a third time to make sure she understood correctly. Well? Rook stood in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. We won. Sort of. What does sort of mean? Eleanor looked up at him, hardly believing it herself. Judge Morrison ruled that the railroad failed to demonstrate sufficient necessity. He's denying the eminent domain petition. Rook's face went through several emotions in rapid succession. Shock, relief, something that might have been joy. We won, he said. We won this round, Eleanor clarified. The railroad can appeal. They probably will appeal. This isn't over. But right now, today, they can't take the land. Right now, today, the land is still yours. Rook crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled Eleanor into a hug that lifted her completely off her feet. She laughed, startled, and hugged him back with all the relief and triumph and sheer disbelief coursing through her. When he set her down, they were both grinning like idiots. We actually did it, Eleanor said. You did it, all that research, all those hours. That's what made the difference. Samuel presented it well, because you gave him something worth presenting. They were standing very close now, close enough that Eleanor could see the lighter flecks in Rook's dark eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that when he ducked his head slightly and kissed her, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Eleanor had been kissed before. Awkward attempts by suitors who were trying to overlook her height for the sake of her father's money. Mechanical, uncomfortable encounters that felt more like business transactions than affection. This was nothing like that. This was Rook's hand cupping her face with surprising gentleness, his beard scratching slightly against her skin, the solid warmth of him, and the way he kissed her like she was something precious he'd been afraid to reach for. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Sorry, Rook said. Should have asked first. Don't you dare apologize. Eleanor was surprised by the fierceness in her own voice. Not sorry for the kiss. Sorry for not asking permission. Rook, if you ask permission for the next one, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. He kissed her again. Slower this time. Deeper. With the kind of certainty that came from knowing this was right and real, and had been building between them for months. When they finally broke apart for air, Eleanor was dizzy. We should probably tell the others, she said, about the ruling. And about this? Eleanor considered. Let's tell them about the ruling first, save the rest for later. Later when? Later when we've figured out what this is. Rook nodded. Fair. They told the others over dinner. Silas whooped and clapped Rook on the back hard enough to stagger him. Martin demanded details about the ruling. Jacob smiled quietly and raised his cup in a silent toast. The celebration was modest but genuine. Extra whiskey in the coffee. Stories told and retold about the hearing. Plans discussed for what to do if the railroad appealed. Through it all, Eleanor caught Rook watching her with an expression that made her stomach flutter. And every time their eyes met, she had to fight not to smile like a complete fool. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, Eleanor sat in her room and thought about what had happened. The legal victory, yes, but also the kiss. The way Rook had held her like she was something valuable. The way she'd felt standing in his arms, safe and seen and exactly the right size. All her life, people had made her feel like she needed to shrink, to take up less space, to apologize for her height and her capabilities and her refusal to fit into neat categories. Rook made her feel like she could expand, take up more space, be exactly as much as she was without apology. That was worth more than any legal victory. That was worth fighting for. The railroad appealed within 2 weeks. Eleanor had expected it, but the speed still stung. The company filed with the Territorial Supreme Court, citing judicial error and renewing their necessity claims with additional engineering reports and cost analyses. "They're not going to stop," Samuel Warren wrote in his letter explaining the appeal. "Companies like this never do. They'll keep pushing until they win, or until fighting costs more than it's worth to them." Eleanor read the letter aloud to Rook while they sat on the porch watching summer settle over the valley. It was early June, warm enough that being outside felt good instead of dangerous, and the world had turned green in that sudden way spring managed in the mountains. "So we keep fighting," Rook said. His arm was around her shoulders, a casualness they'd developed over the past few weeks that still made Eleanor's heart skip. "The appeal will cost more. Samuel says we're looking at least another $500 in legal fees. We have it. Barely, and if we lose, we'll figure it out." Rook pulled her closer. "We've gotten this far, not giving up now." Eleanor leaned into him, breathing in the smell of pine and wood smoke that seemed permanently attached to his clothes. "I'm just tired of fighting." "I know. I want to think about other things, normal things, like whether we need to order more inventory for fall, or if Martin's found anyone to help with the trap lines, or—" She trailed off, aware she was avoiding what she actually wanted to say. "Or," Rook prompted, "or what this is between us, where it's going." Rook was quiet for a moment, then, "What do you want it to be?" "I asked you first." "Eleanor." She twisted to look at him. "I don't know. I've never done this before. Had something real with someone who actually sees me. I don't know what comes next." "Me neither." He touched her face, rough fingers gentle against her cheek. "But I know I don't want you to leave, ever. And I know when you're not around, everything feels wrong. And I know I think about you constantly in ways that probably aren't appropriate for an employer." Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest. "Good thing I'm thinking about you inappropriately too, then." He kissed her, slow and thorough, until Eleanor forgot about the railroad and appeals and everything except the solid reality of him. When they broke apart, Rook rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. Eleanor pulled back, startled. "What?" "Marry me. Make this permanent. Stop worrying about what comes next and just be here, with me, building whatever this is." "Rook, we've only been— This is fast, is it? We've been living together for 6 months, working together, building something together. I know you better than I've known anyone, and you know me. All the parts I usually hide. What else do we need to figure out?" Eleanor's mind was racing. Marriage, the thing she'd traveled across the country hoping to find with Thomas Pritchard, the thing that had seemed like her only option for survival. But this was different. This wasn't desperation. This was choice. "I don't want to marry you because it's practical," she said carefully, "or because I need security. I want it to mean something real." "It does mean something real. It means I love you. Completely. Your height, and your mind, and your stubbornness, and the way you organize things, and argue with me when I'm being an idiot. All of it. I love all of it." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "You've never said that before." "I'm saying it now. I love you, Eleanor Vance, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it every single day. So will you marry me?" She kissed him instead of answering, which Rook took as a yes. And maybe it was. Maybe when someone saw you completely, really saw you, not just the parts that were easy or convenient, and loved you anyway, you didn't need time to think about it. "Yes," Eleanor said when they finally broke apart. "Yes, I'll marry you." Rook's smile was so wide it looked almost painful. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing in a way she'd never heard from him before. Pure, unguarded joy. When he set her down, they were both grinning like children. "Should we tell the others?" Eleanor asked. "Probably, though Silas already knows." "What? How?" "He pulled me aside last week and said if I didn't propose soon, he was going to lock us in the root cellar until we sorted ourselves out." Eleanor laughed. "That sounds like Silas." They told everyone at dinner. Martin whooped and demanded details about when the wedding would be. Jacob smiled his quiet smile and said he'd known it was coming. Silas just said, "About damn time," and poured everyone whiskey to celebrate. "So when's the wedding?" Martin asked again. Eleanor looked at Rook. They hadn't discussed that part. "Soon," Rook said. "Don't want to wait." "August?" Eleanor suggested. "That gives us time to plan something small but proper." August works. Planning a wedding in the mountains turned out to be simpler than Eleanor had expected, mostly because their expectations were modest. They'd marry here in the valley, not in town. Reverend Michaels from Cutter's Pass agreed to come up and perform the ceremony. Eleanor would wear her best dress, the blue wool she'd arrived in, carefully maintained, and Rook would wear whatever clean clothes he owned. "You should get a new suit," Eleanor said one evening while they were going over the very short guest list. "Don't need a suit. It's your wedding. Our wedding. And I'm not uncomfortable the whole day just to look fancy." Eleanor considered arguing, then decided she didn't actually care. She'd fallen in love with Rook in his work clothes and worn boots. Putting him in a suit wouldn't make the day more meaningful. "Fine, but you're at least trimming that beard." "Deal." The real complication came 3 weeks before the wedding, when Eleanor's mother arrived unannounced. Eleanor heard the wagon coming up the valley road and went out to see who it was. The sight of her mother, perfectly dressed even after hours of travel, sitting ramrod straight in a hired wagon, made Eleanor's stomach drop. "Mother." "Eleanor." Her mother climbed down with assistance from the driver, surveying the valley with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. "So this is where you've been hiding." "I haven't been hiding. I've been working." "For 6 months without a single letter home." "You never wrote me either, except that one letter about the court case." Her mother's lips thinned. "May I come inside? I've traveled quite a distance." Eleanor led her into the main house, acutely aware of how rough everything must look to someone used to Boston drawing rooms. The practical furniture, the work table still covered in business documents, the smell of wood smoke and leather and honest labor. Rook emerged from the kitchen, saw Eleanor's mother, and stopped short. "Mother, this is Callum Rook. Rook, this is my mother, Catherine Vance." Eleanor watched her mother take in Rook's size, his rough appearance, the way he filled the doorway. Watched her do the mental calculations that Eleanor could practically see happening. "Mr. Rook, I've heard about you." "Ma'am." Rook's voice had gone flat, carefully neutral. An awkward silence stretched out. Then Eleanor's mother turned to her. "Eleanor, might we speak privately?" Eleanor showed her upstairs to the small room that had become home. Her mother looked around at the simple furnishings, the practical arrangements, the life Eleanor had built. "You're really going to marry him," her mother said. Not a question. "Yes." "He's not what I imagined for you." "No, he's better." Her mother sat on this chair, the only place to sit besides the bed. "Your father thinks you've lost your mind. Living in the wilderness with a man who's barely civilized, throwing away any chance at respectability. And what do you think?" Catherine Vance was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I think you look happier than I've ever seen you. Even as a child, you always seemed uncomfortable, like you were wearing clothes that didn't fit right. But now," she gestured at Eleanor, "now you look like you fit." Eleanor sat on the bed, stunned. "You came all this way to tell me that?" "I came to see if you were all right, to see if you needed rescuing from some terrible situation, but you don't need rescuing, do you?" "No. I found exactly what I was looking for, just not in the way I expected." Her mother nodded slowly. "He loves you. I could see it in the way he looked at you, like you're the only thing in the room worth looking at. I love him too. Even though he's not refined or educated or any of the things we raised you to value, especially because he's not those things. He's honest and loyal and works harder than anyone I've ever met. He sees me as I actually am and loves me for it. That matters more than refinement." Catherine stood and walked to the window, looking out at the valley. "I failed you, Eleanor. I let your father dictate how we raised you, let him push you toward a future that was never going to make you happy. I should have fought for you, helped you find your own path instead of the one we'd chosen." "Mother, let me finish. I'm here to give you something I should have given you years ago, my blessing and my support. If you want to marry this mountain man and build a life in the wilderness, then you have my approval, for whatever that's worth." Eleanor felt something tight in her chest loosen. She hadn't realized how much she'd wanted her mother's approval until it was offered. "It's worth more than you know," Eleanor said quietly. Her mother turned from the window. "Good. Then let's discuss this wedding, because if my daughter is getting married, it's going to be done properly, even if it is in the middle of nowhere." Over the next few days, Catherine Vance proceeded to organize a wedding with the same efficiency she'd once applied to Boston society events. She bullied the local dressmaker into creating a proper wedding dress, simple but beautiful, made to fit Eleanor's actual height instead of some imagined ideal. She coordinated with Reverend Michaels on the ceremony details. She even convinced Silas to let her help with the wedding meal planning, which was a diplomatic miracle. Rook watched all this with bemused tolerance. "Your mother is terrifying," he told Eleanor one evening. "I know, but she means well. She reorganized my entire kitchen." "Did she improve it?" "Yeah, but that's not the point." Eleanor laughed and kissed him. "Just survive 2 more weeks, then she'll go back to Boston and we can return to our normal chaos." "Can't wait." But Eleanor noticed that Rook was polite to her mother, even when Catherine was at her most bossy. And her mother, in turn, treated Rook with respect that Eleanor had never seen her show to anyone her father considered beneath them socially. They were trying. For her sake, they were both trying. That meant everything. The railroad's appeal was denied in mid-July. The Territorial Supreme Court ruled that Judge Morrison had been correct in his assessment, and furthermore questioned whether the railroad had adequately explored all alternative routes. The decision was final. No further appeals were possible within the territorial court system. They could still appeal to federal court, Samuel warned in his letter. But that's expensive and time-consuming, and there's no guarantee they'd win. Most companies give up at this point. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, afraid to believe it was really over. "It's done," Rook said, reading over her shoulder. "We won." "You think they'll really stop?" "I think they'll move on to easier targets. We've cost them too much time and money already." He was right. 2 weeks passed with no new legal filings. Then a month. Then 2 months. The railroad had given up. Eleanor woke up the morning of her wedding to sunshine streaming through her window and the sound of organized chaos downstairs. Her mother was directing operations with military precision. Silas was arranging chairs in the meadow where the ceremony would take place. Martin was stringing up decorations that looked charmingly amateur. Jacob was testing the stability of the arch they'd built for Eleanor and Rook to stand under. Eleanor dressed carefully in the gown her mother had commissioned. It was beautiful, cream-colored silk with simple lines that didn't try to disguise her height, but instead worked with it. The sleeves reached her wrists. The hem fell to exactly the right length. When Eleanor looked in the mirror, she saw herself as she actually was. Tall, yes, but also strong, confident, ready. There was a knock at her door. "Come in." Her mother entered, already dressed for the ceremony. She stopped when she saw Eleanor. Oh, you look beautiful." "The dress is perfect. Thank you for arranging it." Catherine crossed the room and took Eleanor's hands. "I'm proud of you. I should have said that before, but I'm saying it now. You took a terrible situation and turned it into something extraordinary. That takes courage." "I was just trying to survive." "We're all trying to survive, dear. But you managed to do it on your own terms. That's the extraordinary part." They stood there for a moment, mother and daughter, before Catherine pulled Eleanor into a hug. "Your father sends his regards, by the way," Catherine said, pulling back. "And a bank draft. He won't say he was wrong, but the money is his way of acknowledging you've done well for yourself." "I don't need his money." "I know, but take it anyway. Let him participate in this the only way he knows how." Eleanor nodded. She could do that much. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock, when the light in the valley turned golden and soft. Guests started arriving around 3, neighbors from nearby valleys, trappers and timber workers who'd done business with Rook, even a few people from town including Mrs. Donnelly and the school teachers who'd befriended Eleanor during her brief time there. Thomas Pritchard came too with his quiet fiancée Mary. He congratulated Eleanor with genuine warmth and didn't once mention her height or suggest she'd made an unusual choice. Maybe he'd learned something. Or maybe he just recognized that Eleanor had found something he was still looking for. At 4 o'clock precisely, Eleanor walked down the path toward the meadow where everyone waited. Her mother had wanted to arrange for someone to give her away, but Eleanor had refused. She was walking into this marriage on her own terms, under her own power. Rook stood under the arch, wearing new clothes that weren't quite a suit, but were clearly his best effort at formal. His beard was trimmed, his hair was pulled back, and when he saw Eleanor, his entire face transformed. Eleanor had spent her whole life being looked at, stared at, examined, judged. But the way Rook looked at her now was different. It was recognition, admiration, love so clear it made her throat tight. She reached him and took his hands. Reverend Michaels began the ceremony with the traditional words, but Eleanor barely heard them. She was too focused on Rook, on the way his hands held hers steady and sure, on the absolute certainty in his eyes. When it came time for vows, Rook spoke first. "Eleanor, I'm not good with words. Never have been. But you've taught me that some things are worth struggling to say. So here it is. You came into my life when I'd convinced myself I didn't need anyone. Proven yourself capable and smart and braver than anyone I've ever met. You fought for me when you didn't have to, stood by me when you could have walked away. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love someone. And I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." Blob. Eleanor's turn. She'd planned what to say, rehearsed it even. But standing there with Rook's hands in hers and everyone watching, the prepared words fled. "I spent most of my life being told I was too much," she said instead. "Too tall, too opinionated, too difficult to accommodate. I tried to make myself smaller, quieter, easier. It never worked. Then I met you, and for the first time someone looked at me and said, 'You're exactly enough.' You gave me space to be myself without apology. You trusted me when I had no reason to earn trust. You built me a coat that fit and a life that fits even better. I love you, Callum Rook, and I promise to keep fighting for us, for this life we're building, for as long as I'm breathing." Reverend Michaels pronounced them married. Rook kissed her in front of everyone, not caring who was watching. And Eleanor kissed him back, thinking about how far she'd come from that frozen train platform where Thomas Pritchard had rejected her. That rejection had felt like the end of everything. It had actually been the beginning. The celebration lasted well into the evening. There was food, so much food, thanks to Catherine's planning and Silas's cooking. There was music. Martin had brought his fiddle and several guests had instruments. There was dancing in the meadow while the sun set and the stars came out. Eleanor danced with Rook, both of them laughing at their own lack of skill. She danced with Silas and Jacob and Martin. She even danced with her mother, who admitted that perhaps the wilderness wasn't quite as uncivilized as she'd feared. Around midnight, guests started departing or settling into the barn where sleeping space had been arranged. Eleanor and Rook slipped away to the main house, suddenly alone for the first time all day. "Hello, wife," Rook said, pulling her close. "Hello, husband. That feels good to say. It feels good to hear." He kissed her, slow and deep, and Eleanor let herself sink into the certainty of it. This man, this life, this choice she'd made. Later, lying in Rook's bed, their bed now, with his arm around her and the window open to let in mountain air, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. The desperation that had driven her to answer a marriage advertisement from a stranger. The humiliation of rejection. The terror of being stranded with no money and no prospects. The gamble of accepting work from a man everyone said was strange and possibly dangerous. Every step had felt like potential disaster. Every step had led her exactly where she needed to be. "You awake?" Rook's voice was quiet in the darkness. "Yeah." "Thinking about anything specific?" "About how much has changed in a year. This time last year, I was in Boston helping my father with correspondence and listening to him explain why I needed to find a husband before I became completely unmarriageable. His loss. That's what I was thinking. He tried so hard to fit me into what he thought I should be. But I never fit that mold. I just broke pieces of myself trying." Rook pulled her closer. "You don't have to break anything here. You can just be whatever you actually are." "I know. That's what I love most about this place. About you. There's no performance required, no pretending." "Good. Because I'm terrible at pretending." Eleanor laughed. "I've noticed." They lay there in comfortable silence for a while. Then Eleanor spoke again. "Rook?" "Yeah?" "Thank you for seeing me when everyone else was looking past me." "Eleanor, love, you're 6 feet tall. Nobody could look past you, even if they tried. You know what I mean. I do, and you're welcome. But you should know, I'm not some saint who rescued you from a bad situation. You saved yourself, built yourself a life from nothing but stubbornness and intelligence. I just gave you space to do it. We saved each other then. Yeah, I can live with that. Eleanor drifted towards sleep, thinking about what they'd built together. A business that was thriving, a home that felt solid and real, a partnership based on mutual respect and honest affection. But more than that, they'd built proof that the world's narrow expectations didn't have to define you, that being too much for some people just meant you were exactly right for the right person, that sometimes the biggest disasters open doors to the best possibilities. Morning came with sunshine and the sound of people moving around downstairs, guests who'd stayed over, probably, or her mother organizing breakfast with her usual efficiency. Eleanor stretched, feeling the pleasant ache of muscles well used, and smiled at Rook, who was already awake and watching her. Morning, wife? Morning, husband. Ready to face everyone? Not particularly, but I suppose we should. They dressed and went downstairs to find Catherine directing breakfast preparation, while Silas looked on with amusement. Most of the overnight guests had already left, but a few remained, including Samuel Warren, who traveled from Denver for the wedding. Congratulations again, Samuel said, shaking Rook's hand. And I have news about the railroad. Eleanor tensed. What news? They've officially filed route plans using one of the alternative corridors. Your valley isn't mentioned anywhere in the documentation. It's over, completely. The relief was so intense Eleanor had to sit down. You're sure? Rook asked. Positive. I have copies of the filed plans if you want to see them, but yes, I'm sure. They've moved on. Catherine brought coffee and sat down with them. So what happens now with the business, I mean? Will you expand, diversify? Eleanor and Rook looked at each other. They hadn't really discussed long-term plans, too focused on just surviving the immediate crises. We'll keep doing what we're doing, Rook said finally. Building something sustainable. Maybe hire more help as we grow, but nothing too dramatic. That sounds reasonable, Catherine said. Though, Eleanor, you should know, your father mentioned something about wanting to invest in Western ventures. If you needed capital for expansion, we'll think about it, Eleanor said carefully. She wasn't ready to be completely dependent on her father's money, but she also wasn't foolish enough to refuse help that came with no strings attached. Over the next few days, guests departed until it was just the regular household again. Rook, Eleanor, Silas, Jacob, and Martin. Catherine left last, extracting promises from Eleanor to write more regularly and to visit Boston if they ever traveled east. I like him, Catherine told Eleanor privately before she left. You're Mr. Rook. He's honest. That's rare in men of any class. I know. Be happy, Eleanor. You've earned it. After her mother left, Eleanor and Rook settled into married life with surprising ease. The rhythms they'd established over months of working together held steady. Eleanor managed the business side while Rook handled the physical operations. They made decisions together, argued when they disagreed, compromised when necessary. And at night, they learned each other in ways that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with building intimacy. Fall arrived, and with it came the busy season. Trappers preparing for winter, timber operations ramping up before snow made the work impossible, orders to fill and supplies to manage. Eleanor threw herself into the work with energy she hadn't felt in years. This was hers, this business, this life, this purpose. Not something she'd been assigned or forced into, but something she'd chosen and built. One evening in late September, Eleanor was updating the ledgers when she realized something. The business had grown significantly over the past year. Revenue was up 40%. They'd expanded their supplier network, added 3 new trappers to their trading relationships, improved efficiency across every metric she tracked. Rook, she called. He came in from outside, carrying wood for the fire. Yeah? We're successful, actually successful, not just surviving anymore. He set down the wood and came to look at the ledger. That's good, right? It's very good. It means we can think about the future in bigger terms. Maybe hire permanent help, invest in better equipment, build proper structures for storage instead of using the barn. Expand. Yes, if you want to. Rook studied the numbers, that same intense focus he brought to everything. What do you want? Eleanor thought about it. I want to build something that lasts, something that proves people like us, people who don't fit the normal patterns, can succeed on our own terms, something that makes all the fighting worthwhile, then that's what we'll do. It was that simple for him. No second guessing, no endless deliberation, just a decision made and committed to. Eleanor loved that about him. Winter came again, and with it the familiar isolation. But this year felt different. Eleanor wasn't trapped by circumstances anymore. She was choosing to be here, building something with someone she loved. They spent long evenings planning for spring, what improvements to make, which new ventures to explore, how to grow without losing the core of what made their operation work. "We should think about taking on an apprentice," Eleanor said one night. "Someone young we can train properly, someone who maybe doesn't fit anywhere else but could thrive here." Rook looked up from the book he was reading. He'd graduated to more complex texts now, though he still asked Eleanor for help with difficult words. "Like we did." "Exactly like we did. Give someone else the chance we got." "I like that idea." They put out word in town and by early spring had applications from several young people looking for work. Eleanor interviewed them all, looking for that particular quality she and Rook shared: intelligence paired with desperation, capability mixed with not fitting into normal spaces. She found it in a 16-year-old girl named Margaret, who was too smart for the limited options available to women in Cutter's Pass and too poor to pursue education elsewhere. "Why do you want to work here?" Eleanor asked during the interview. Margaret looked her straight in the eye. "Because I heard you don't care if people are different. You just care if they can do the work. And I can do the work." Eleanor hired her on the spot. Margaret moved into the room Eleanor had occupied when she first arrived, the small space under the eaves that was cold in winter but private. She learned quickly, absorbed information like a sponge, and asked questions that showed real understanding of how the business operated. Watching her, Eleanor saw echoes of herself a year and a half ago. Desperate but determined, afraid but refusing to show it, ready to prove herself if just given the chance. "She reminds me of you," Rook said one evening after Margaret had retired to her room. "I was thinking the same thing. Think she'll stay? If we give her reasons to stay, if we show her this can be a real future, not just a temporary stop, then that's what we'll do." Spring turned to summer and the valley erupted with life. Wildflowers covered the meadows. Birds returned from wherever they'd spent the winter. The river ran high with snowmelt. Eleanor discovered she was pregnant in June. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't been certain until the pattern became undeniable. The exhaustion, the nausea that hit at odd times, the way her body felt different in subtle ways she couldn't quite name. She told Rook on a Sunday evening when they were alone on the porch, watching sunset paint the mountains orange and pink. "I'm pregnant." Rook went very still. Then, "You're sure?" "Pretty sure. All the signs are there." He pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was made of glass. I don't know what to say." "You're happy?" Eleanor asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy? Eleanor, I'm terrified and thrilled and about a dozen other things I don't have words for." She laughed, relieved. "Me too." They sat there as darkness fell, talking about the future in concrete terms now. A baby meant changes to their living space, their work arrangements, their entire lives. But Eleanor found she wasn't afraid of those changes. She was building a life where a child could grow up seeing their mother work and their father respect that work. Where being different wasn't something to hide, but just another way of being. Where people were valued for what they contributed, not how well they conformed. That seemed like a good world to bring a child into. The baby was born in February during a blizzard that trapped them all inside for 3 days. Dr. Harrison from town had been staying with them for a week waiting for the birth, which turned out to be fortunate timing. The labor was long and difficult. Eleanor's height worked against her in some ways, made things complicated in ways the doctor hadn't expected. But 20 hours after it started, Eleanor held a squalling, red-faced daughter who had Rook's dark hair and lungs that suggested she'd inherited her mother's determination. "She's perfect," Rook said, touching the baby's tiny hand with one enormous finger. "She's loud," Eleanor corrected, exhausted but grinning. "That too." They named her Catherine Margaret, after Eleanor's mother who'd surprised them by supporting their unconventional life, and after young Margaret, who'd become part of their household and would help care for the baby while Eleanor recovered. Catherine Vance made the journey out for the birth, arriving 2 weeks later when the roads were passable again. She held her granddaughter with tears in her eyes and told Eleanor she'd done well. "Your father sends his congratulations," Catherine said, "and more money. He's determined to help whether you want it or not." "I'm learning to accept help," Eleanor said, "even from unexpected sources." "That's growth, dear." Over the following months, Eleanor navigated motherhood with the same practical approach she brought to everything else. Some days were wonderful, watching Rook's enormous hands carefully cradling their tiny daughter, seeing the wonder on his face when Catherine smiled for the first time. Other days were exhausting chaos, sleepless nights, constant feeding, the physical recovery that took longer than expected. But through it all, Eleanor had support. Rook took on more of the household work without complaint. Margaret helped with the baby and gradually took over more business responsibilities. Silas cooked meals that helped Eleanor rebuild her strength. The entire household adjusted to make space for this new life. And Eleanor realized something profound. She'd built a family. Not the traditional kind with rigid roles and clear hierarchies, but something better. A chosen family bound together by mutual respect and shared purpose. 2 years after Catherine was born, Eleanor stood in the meadow where she and Rook had married and looked at everything they'd created. The business had grown to employ 12 people full-time. Margaret was running much of the correspondence now, proving herself invaluable. They'd built new storage buildings and expanded the trading network across 3 territories. But more than the business success, they'd created something else. A place where people who didn't fit elsewhere could find purpose. A community built on capability rather than conformity. Young Margaret had been joined by 2 other apprentices, a boy from town whose stutter made communication difficult, but whose mathematical mind was extraordinary, and a Shoshone woman named Sarah, whose family had been displaced by settlers and who'd found refuge in their operation. All of them outsiders. All of them valuable. Rook came up behind Eleanor and wrapped his arms around her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how far we've come. How different everything is from what I imagined that day I stepped off the train. Better or worse?" Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. Their daughter was inside napping, watched over by Margaret. The business was running smoothly. The railroad had moved on to bother someone else. The valley was theirs, safe and secure. "So much better," Eleanor said. "Better than I knew how to hope for." Same. They stood there together, 2 people the world had tried to diminish, who'd found each other and built something that refused to be diminished. Something that said loudly and clearly, "We are exactly enough as we are." And in the end, that was the whole story. Not a tale of perfection or easy victories. Not a romance where everything fell into place without struggle. But a story of 2 imperfect people who'd been rejected by the world's narrow standards and decided to build their own standards instead. Eleanor had spent her whole life being too much, too tall, too capable, too difficult to fit into prescribed roles. It turned out she just needed to find the right space. A space where too much was exactly the right amount. A space she built herself, with her own hands and someone else's help, brick by brick and choice by choice. And standing in that meadow with Rook's arms around her and the mountains rising behind them, Eleanor Vance, now Eleanor Rook, finally understood what belonging felt like. Not shrinking to fit someone else's expectations, but expanding to fill the space you created for yourself. That was worth every risk she'd taken to get here. That was worth everything.